Daniel Carter slammed his badge down on that boardroom table so hard the water glasses shook. Every executive in that room went dead silent. Victoria Blackthorne, the CEO, who had just told him in front of 300 people that he would now answer to her 26-year-old nephew, stared at him like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. And Daniel looked right back at her and said 7 words that would eventually cost her company $40 million. "You'll find out what I was worth." Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if stories like this hit home for you, subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what happens next. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up on any medical chart. It doesn't come from working too many hours, although Daniel Carter had certainly done that. It doesn't come from carrying too many responsibilities, although he had carried more than his share for the better part of a decade. It comes from something quieter and more corrosive than either of those things. It comes from pouring everything you have into something every morning, every late night, every ounce of energy and creativity and problem-solving ability you possess, and watching someone else take a bow. Daniel Carter knew that exhaustion intimately. He had been living inside it for 9 years. But on the morning of October the 14th, he drove to work the same way he always did. He made his daughter Emma's lunch first. She was 9 years old, and she had recently developed a strong opinion about the way her sandwich was cut diagonally, not straight across, and don't you dare mix it up. So Daniel stood at the kitchen counter at 5:45 in the morning, making sure the cut was exactly right. He poured her orange juice. He wrote a small note on a yellow sticky pad and put it in her lunchbox, the same way he had done every single school day since kindergarten. "Have a great day, Bug. I love you more than pizza." Emma thought that was the funniest thing in the world when he first wrote it. Now she was 9 and too sophisticated for it, but she still looked for it every morning. He drove her to school, kissed her on the forehead while she pretended to be embarrassed, and then he turned the car toward downtown and the 40-story glass tower that housed Meridian Technologies. He arrived at 7:08 a.m. Parking garage attendant, a retired veteran named Lou, who had been working that garage for 11 years, waved him in without needing to see a badge. "Morning, Mr. Carter." "Morning, Lou. How's the knee?" "Better when it rains less, which in this city means never." Daniel laughed. He took the elevator to the 22nd floor, where the Operations and Client Services Division occupied the entire East Wing, and he sat down at his desk and opened his laptop and began solving problems before most of the executives upstairs had finished their first cup of coffee. This was the invisible rhythm of Daniel Carter's professional life. And for 9 years that rhythm had produced extraordinary results. The Meridian Technologies Operations Division had not always been the company's crown jewel. When Daniel first joined the company as a senior project manager in the early days of his career, the division was what people in the industry called politely underperforming, and what people in the division called honestly a disaster waiting to happen. 3 major client contracts had been on the verge of cancellation. The internal team was demoralized, fractured, and deeply mistrustful of leadership. Turnover was running at nearly 40% annually. The VP, who had been running things before Daniel arrived, had managed the department the way some people manage a burning building, by pretending the smoke wasn't there and hoping someone else would deal with the fire. By the time that VP was quietly moved to a less visible role, and Daniel was asked, not promoted, just asked with no formal title change and a modest raise that barely covered the increased responsibility to take point on stabilizing things, the division had already lost 2 of its top 10 clients and was in serious danger of losing a third. Daniel did not come in with a dramatic turnaround plan. He did not deliver a powerful speech. He did not hire a consulting firm or commission a strategy deck or schedule a series of all-hands meetings to talk about realigning the culture. He sat down with his team members one at a time and he asked them a single question. "Tell me what's broken and tell me what we'd need to fix it." Then he listened. That was it. That was the strategy. Not silence listening. Real listening. The kind where you don't check your phone or think about your next meeting. The kind where you look at a person and make them feel like what they're saying actually matters. A 43-year-old project coordinator named Beverly, who had been with the company for 11 years and had never once been asked her opinion by anyone above her in the organizational chart, cried during that first conversation. Not dramatically, not in a way she announced. Just a few quiet tears that she wiped away quickly and apologized for. "Don't apologize," Daniel said. "Just keep talking." She did. Within 60 days of Daniel taking over, the tone of the division had fundamentally changed. Not the structure, not the systems, those would come later. The tone, the feeling in the room, the way people walked in on Monday mornings. He created a weekly debrief that was mandatory, not for the purpose of reporting to leadership, but for the purpose of the team talking to each other, identifying problems, early sharing solutions, preventing the kind of siloed breakdown that had crippled the department before. He saved the third major client contract by flying to Chicago on a Saturday morning with a folder full of data and a genuine apology for the company's previous failures. He didn't make excuses. He didn't deflect. He sat across a conference table from a very skeptical operations director named Gerald Marsh and said, "I understand why you're ready to leave. You've been patient and we haven't earned it. Here's what I'm going to do differently, and here's how I'll prove it to you in the next 90 days. Gerald Marsh did not leave. 2 years later, Gerald Marsh's company expanded their contract with Meridian to 3 times its original value. That was Daniel Carter. Not flashy, not political, not the kind of person who sent company-wide emails about his own accomplishments or angled for FaceTime with senior leadership to make sure they saw him winning. He just solved problems. He just built things. He just showed up every single day and did the work. The irony was not lost on him that the person who received the most credit for the division's success was the person who understood it the least. Victoria Blackthorne had been appointed CEO of Meridian Technologies 4 years into Daniel's tenure. She was 61 years old, elegantly dressed, possessing of a voice that could fill a room without ever quite raising itself. And she had an instinct for organizational theater that was genuinely impressive to watch. She knew how to walk into a room and own it. She knew how to speak to investors. She knew how to make a struggling narrative sound like a victory lap. What she did not know, or perhaps more accurately what she had never needed to learn, was how the actual work got done. In the early days of her tenure, she and Daniel had a relatively functional working relationship. She left him alone because the division was performing. He delivered results, and she presented them to the board, and if she occasionally implied in those presentations that her leadership vision had been the driving force behind the numbers, Daniel had made a quiet peace with that. He wasn't naive. He understood how organizations worked. The person at the top gets the credit for what happens below. That was the deal. He told himself it was fine. For a long time it mostly was. But over the years, Victoria's relationship with the truth of the division's success became increasingly creative. In media interviews, she described the operations division as my passion project from day one. In investor presentations, she talked about the strategy I implemented to recover the client relationships. At the company's annual gala, she gave a speech about leadership and vision that lasted 40 minutes, and Daniel's name appeared in it exactly once in the context of the strong team I assembled. His team heard it. Beverly heard it. His project leads heard it. Nobody said anything to Daniel directly because they understood the politics and they didn't want to make him feel worse. But he could see it in the way they looked at each other during that speech. The small tightening around the eyes. The carefully neutral expressions. He drove home that night, and Emma was already in bed, and he sat in the kitchen in the dark for a while drinking coffee. He didn't really need, and he thought about what it meant to spend your life building things that other people got to put their name on. I thought about his father, a man who had worked 31 years for a railroad company and retired with a handshake and a cheap watch, who had once told Daniel, "Son, the world will take what you let it take. The trick is knowing what you can't afford to give." Daniel had thought about that conversation many times over the years. He thought about it that night. He still wasn't sure what he could afford to give. But he was beginning to have a clearer sense of what he couldn't. His personal life was the thing that kept him honest about all of it. Emma's mother. Karen had left when Emma was 2 years old. It was not a dramatic departure, no screaming fights, no epic betrayals. It was quieter than that, and in some ways, the quietness made it harder to process. Karen had simply discovered in the particular crucible of early parenthood that she was not built for the life she had chosen. She loved Emma. Daniel believed that completely, but she loved her from a distance that gradually became permanent. She moved to Portland. She sent birthday cards. She called on holidays. Emma had adjusted to this reality with the particular resilience of children who have never known anything different. But Daniel watched her sometimes at school pickup, when other kids ran to their mothers at parent-teacher nights, when the empty chair beside him drew the careful not noticing of other parents, and he felt the weight of what he was carrying for both of them. He never complained about it. Not to his colleagues, not to his family, not to the handful of friends he still managed to maintain, despite a schedule that left almost no room for a personal life. He just carried it, the same way he carried everything else. How was the person who showed up? That was who Daniel Carter was at his core in every part of his life. The person who showed up did the work, handled the crisis, protected the people who depended on him, and asked for very little in return. His only ask was simple: respect the work. Not applause, not credit, not a parade. Just acknowledge that the work matters. Treat the person doing it like a professional whose judgment and experience count for something. That wasn't a high bar, or so he thought. The rumors started on a Tuesday in September. Daniel heard them the way he heard most things, not through official channels, not from Victoria's office, but from the informal network of people who actually knew how the company ran. A budget coordinator named Marcus, who had been with Meridian for 14 years, and had a nearly supernatural ability to know things before they were officially announced, stopped by Daniel's office at 4:45 p.m. with 2 cups of coffee and a look on his face that Daniel had learned over the years meant something was coming. "You hear anything about the executive team changes?" Daniel looked up from his laptop. "What changes?" Marcus set one of the coffee cups on Daniel's desk and sat down in the chair across from him without being invited. That in itself told Daniel something. "Word is Victoria's nephew is joining the company." "Okay." "Senior leadership track." Daniel put down his pen. "How senior?" Marcus looked at him for a moment. "That's the part I'm still trying to confirm." After Marcus left, Daniel sat at his desk for a while without looking at anything in particular. He had met Adrian Blackthorne once at a company event about 18 months earlier. Victoria had introduced him around the room with the specific energy of a person presenting evidence of something wonderful. And Adrian had been perfectly charming in the way that people who have grown up wealthy and confident are often perfectly charming. Easy smile, handshake, the comfortable assumption that everyone in the room was happy to meet him. He had just finished his MBA from a well-regarded school. He had done a brief internship at a financial firm in New York. He was 26 years old, and he had the particular self-assurance of a young man who had been told at every stage of his life that he was exceptional. Daniel had shaken his hand and moved on and not thought much about him afterward. Now he thought about him. He thought about what senior leadership track in the operations division might actually mean. He thought about Marcus's careful, unfinished sentence. "That's the part I'm still trying to confirm." He called his babysitter to stay late, drove back to the office at 8 o'clock that night, and pulled up every project timeline and client status report his division had active. He reviewed them all. He thought about vulnerabilities. He thought about things that required institutional knowledge to navigate the specific way that Gerald Marsh at the expanded client account liked to receive his monthly briefings. The internal politics within the Hartfield group that required careful handling the 3 team members who were exceptionally talented, but who needed particular kinds of management to perform at their best. I thought about what that would mean if someone without that knowledge were placed in a position of authority over those things. He wrote a comprehensive briefing document, 14 pages, cataloging the active projects, the client relationships, the team dynamics, and the strategic priorities for the next 12 months. He was not writing it because anyone had asked for it. He was writing it because he was already worried. The annual company meeting was held in the main ballroom of the Meridian Technologies corporate campus, a space that held about 400 people, and that was used 3 or 4 times a year for events important enough to require the assembled presence of the full professional organization. Daniel sat in the fourth row center section. His deputy director, a sharp, understated woman named Patricia Graves, sat beside him. They had worked together for 6 years. Patricia had a talent for reading rooms that Daniel had always admired. She could assess the emotional temperature of a gathering in about 30 seconds and give you an accurate forecast of what was going to happen. As they watched the stage, she leaned slightly toward him and murmured, "Why is he up there?" Daniel followed her eyeline to the stage where Adrian Blackthorne was standing slightly behind Victoria in a position that was not quite center stage, but was also clearly not accidental. "I don't know yet," Daniel said quietly. "His posture is wrong," Patricia said. Daniel looked at her. "For someone who's just being introduced as a new hire, his posture is wrong," she said. "He's already standing like someone who's been told the room belongs to him." Daniel said nothing. Victoria approached the podium. She spoke for about 20 minutes about the company's trajectory, the industry landscape, the opportunities ahead. She was, as always, compelling to listen to. She had a way of making whatever she was describing sound not just important, but inevitable, as if the future she was describing was simply waiting for everyone to arrive in it. Then she said, "And as part of our commitment to building the next generation of leadership at Meridian, I'm thrilled to introduce someone who I believe represents exactly the kind of energy and vision this company needs for the years ahead." She paused. "My nephew, Adrian Blackthorne, who will be joining our organization as Executive Director of Operations and Client Strategy." The applause was the kind that a room produces when people are uncertain of what response is expected, but are also unwilling to be the only person not clapping. Daniel did not move. Patricia beside him went very still. Executive Director of Operations and Client Strategy. His division. His title. Or rather, a newly created title, one level above his constructed for a 26-year-old who had never run a department, or saved a client relationship, or rebuilt a team, or done any of the 10,000 unglamorous, difficult, essential things that Daniel had spent 9 years doing. Victoria was still speaking. Something about vision, something about the future, something about how excited she was for this new chapter. Then she looked directly at Daniel. Daniel Carter, as you all know, has been a cornerstone of this division's success. And going forward, Daniel will report directly to Adrian as we continue to build on that success together. The sentence landed in the room like a stone into still water. Daniel heard it. He heard the intake of breath from Patricia beside him. He heard somewhere behind him the very small and very careful sound of 400 people trying to figure out how to react to something they all understood immediately and instinctively was wrong. He didn't look at Victoria. He didn't look at Adrian. He looked straight ahead at the stage, at the company banner behind the podium, at the Meridian Technologies logo. He had spent 9 years working to build the reputation of, and he thought with a perfect crystalline clarity, a single thought. She has no idea what she just did. After the meeting, people moved around him carefully. It was the specific social behavior of colleagues who have witnessed something uncomfortable and are not sure whether to acknowledge it or pretend they didn't see it. Some people found reasons to be across the room. Some people made very focused eye contact with their phones. A few people, the ones he had known longest, the ones whose careers he had invested in and advocated for and protected through difficult moments, came to him and said quiet, genuine things. Beverly touched his arm and didn't say anything at all, which was somehow the most meaningful response in the room. Adrian found him near the far edge of the space by the catering table, about 40 minutes into the reception. He extended his hand. Daniel shook it. "I just want you to know," Adrian said, and his voice had a quality that Daniel recognized immediately, the careful, practiced warmth of someone who has been coached on how to manage a difficult situation. "That I have tremendous respect for everything you've built here. I'm genuinely excited to learn from you." Daniel looked at him. "I appreciate that," Daniel said. "I know this transition might feel—" "It's fine," Daniel said. Adrian nodded, the practiced warmth shifting briefly into something that might have been relief. "Great. I think we're going to do great things together." He moved away toward another conversation, already scanning the room for the next person he needed to speak to. And Daniel watched him go, and felt something he had not expected to feel. Not anger. Not humiliation. Grief. The grief of someone who has invested years of real care into something and is watching it handed to someone who doesn't know enough yet to understand what they've been given. The first meeting between Daniel and Adrian in an official capacity happened the following Monday morning. Adrian arrived 17 minutes late. Daniel was already seated at the conference table with a prepared briefing packet, the same 14-page document he had assembled weeks earlier, printed and organized with tabs. Adrian sat down, glanced at the packet, and didn't pick it up. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "walk me through the big picture. What are the main things I need to know?" Daniel looked at him. He thought about the Hartfield Group. He thought about Gerald Marsh. He thought about the 3 talent-managed team members who needed particular handling. He thought about Beverly, who had cried during their first conversation 9 years ago, because no one had ever asked for her opinion. "It would be most efficient if you reviewed the briefing document first," Daniel said. "It covers the full landscape active projects client status team structure and the strategic priorities for the next 12 months. Adrian picked up this packet. He flipped through it, the way a person flips through a magazine while waiting for an appointment, not reading, just turning pages. He set it down. "This is great detail," he said. "Really comprehensive. But I'm more of a big-picture thinker. I don't like to get too weighed down in the granular stuff early on. What I'd love is just the 30-second elevator pitch. What's the heart of what this division does?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "The heart of what this division does," he said carefully, "is relationship management. Every result we produce, every client we keep, every contract we grow, every crisis we navigate comes down to trust. We've spent 9 years building trust with clients, with partner teams, with the people in this building. That trust is the asset. Everything else is just process." Adrian nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Trust. Relationship. That's good. I like that framing." He pulled out a notebook, expensive, leather-bound, the kind that says, "I am a person who takes notes on things," and wrote something. "And what do you see as the biggest opportunities for growth? Where have we been leaving value on the table?" Daniel noticed the word "we." Adrian had been in the building for 4 days. "Our current growth strategy," Daniel said, "is built on depth rather than breadth. We deepen relationships with existing high-value clients rather than chasing new volume. That approach has a proven track record with our specific client base." Right. Adrian was still writing. "But I've been doing some thinking, and I wonder if we've been too conservative. There's a lot of market share available if we're willing to be more aggressive in acquisition. We've studied that approach. The risk profile for this division, given the complexity of the client relationships and the integration requirements, is not well suited to rapid acquisition." Adrian looked up from his notebook. "Daniel," he said with a smile that was only slightly too careful to be genuine, "I hear you. And your experience is valuable. I truly believe that. But part of my role here is to push us out of our comfort zones. Sometimes the most experienced people in a room are also the most anchored to the way things have always been done." Daniel looked at him. He did not say what he was thinking. He thought about his father's voice. "The world will take what you let it take." He thought about Emma's lunch and the way the sandwich cut had to be diagonal. He thought about Gerald Marsh sitting across a conference table in Chicago, deciding whether to stay. "I understand," Daniel said. And he went back to his office and closed the door and sat for a very long time. The changes came quickly after that. Adrian's management philosophy, such as it was, prioritized the visible over the functional. He commissioned a rebranding of the division's internal communications, new color scheme, new templates, new naming conventions. He scheduled an all-hands meeting to introduce himself to the team, at which he spoke for 55 minutes about transformation, innovation, and his personal leadership philosophy, and then spent 5 minutes on questions, during which he managed to answer 2 questions with extended monologues about his own vision, and redirect a third to Daniel, as if the question itself were beneath his attention level. He began restructuring the weekly reporting process, replacing the collaborative team debrief that Daniel had built. the one that caught problems early, the one that people actually participated in with a hierarchical reporting model in which team leads submitted individual reports to Adrian, who would review them and determine what required follow-up. Beverly came to Daniel's office the day after that change was announced. She sat in the same chair she always sat in across from his desk, and she said, "He doesn't understand why the debrief works." "I know. It works because people say things in a room together that they'd never put in a report. When you're sitting across from your colleague and you say, 'We have a problem with the Hartfield timeline,' and they say, 'We're having a problem on that end too,' that's how you catch something before it becomes a crisis." "I know, Beverly. Did you explain that to him?" "I tried." She looked at him for a moment. "What did he say?" "He said it was an interesting perspective and that he preferred data-driven decision processes." Beverly was quiet. "He doesn't know what he doesn't know," she finally said. "No," Daniel agreed. "He doesn't." "Is that fixable?" Daniel thought about that question for a long time. "People learn," he said carefully, "if they're willing to." Beverly looked at him with the directness of someone who has worked alongside a person long enough to know when they're being diplomatic. "And if they're not?" Daniel didn't answer. 3 months in, Daniel had documented 41 separate instances in which he had provided recommendations that Adrian had overridden without consultation or explanation. He wasn't keeping the document as a weapon. He was keeping it the way a person keeps a record of warning signs, not hoping to be right, but needing to understand what was actually happening. What was actually happening was this. Adrian was not learning. He was performing. Every decision he made had the quality of a decision designed to look decisive rather than be effective. He moved fast in ways that created the impression of momentum. He used the language of transformation, disruption, optimization, strategic realignment in ways that filled presentations with energy but solved nothing concrete. The team felt it, not dramatically, not in ways they announced in meetings, but in the small daily demoralization of working under someone whose primary interest appeared to be his own advancement. The careful not speaking that happens when experienced people learn that their expertise is not valued. The gradual withdrawal of discretionary effort, not quitting, not complaining, just doing exactly what's required, and no more, because the additional mile you used to walk now feels like walking it for someone who doesn't know it's a mile and wouldn't care if they did. Daniel watched it happening and felt it as a physical pain in his chest. He had built this team, not built in the mechanical sense of hiring and assigning, built in the real sense, invested in, believed in, fought for, protected. He watched them shrinking, and he could not stop it. He tried 3 more times to bring concerns to Adrian with documentation, with data, with as much diplomatic framing as he could manage. The 3rd time, Adrian leaned back in his chair and said something that Daniel had been waiting for without realizing he'd been waiting for it. "Daniel, I think there's a dynamic here that we need to address. I get the sense that you're having a hard time adjusting to the new structure, which I understand you were used to operating with a lot of independence. But the way you keep bringing me these concerns," he made brief slight air quotes, "it reads as resistance. And that's not a good look for you, or for the team you're supposed to be leading." Daniel looked at him. He kept his voice completely level. "I bring you concerns because it's my professional responsibility to make sure the person in charge of this division has accurate information about risks. I appreciate that, but I need you to trust my judgment. I will always trust your judgment. When I've seen your judgment produce results. Right now, what I've seen is several decisions that contradict data we have and relationships we've spent years building." Adrian's expression shifted very slightly. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to take it in the spirit it's intended." He leaned forward. "You built something good here. Nobody's taking that away from you. But sometimes the people who build something can't be the ones to take it to the next level. They're too attached, too close to the old way. That's not a criticism, it's just the reality of growth. My aunt sees that. She brought me in because she wants this company to grow beyond its comfort zone. And I need to know that you're on board with that vision. If you're not," he paused, "let it sit. Then we should probably talk about what your future here looks like. Daniel sat with that for a moment. He thought about 9 years. He thought about Gerald Marsh's third contract renewal. He thought about Beverly crying quietly in that first conversation because no one had ever asked. He thought about Emma's lunch note. "I love you more than pizza." "I hear you," Daniel said. He stood up. He picked up his folder, and he left the room. He drove to school pickup that afternoon, and when Emma climbed into the back seat and dropped her backpack and said, "Dad, Mia said something really unfair today, and I need to tell you about it." He turned the radio off and turned to look at her and said, "Tell me everything." She talked for 20 minutes straight. He listened to every word. That evening, after she was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop and stared at a blank document for about 10 minutes. Then he started writing. Not a briefing, not a project timeline, not another 14-page analysis of divisional risk. He wrote a letter of resignation. It was short, 3 paragraphs. Professional, clear, and completely honest in the particular way that a document can be honest when the person writing it has finally stopped trying to manage other people's comfort. He read it through twice. He closed the laptop without sending it. He sat in the kitchen in the quiet house, and he thought about everything his father had ever told him and everything he had ever told himself, and the distance between what a person deserves and what a person actually receives, and whether that distance is something you close or something you carry. He thought about it for a long time. Then he went to bed. Victoria called him to her office 2 weeks later. He had not sent the letter. He was sitting across from her in the same chair he had sat in dozens of times over the years, a leather chair across from a desk that cost more than some people's cars. And Victoria was looking at him with the specific expression she used when she had decided something and was delivering it with the pretense of conversation. "I want to check in on how things are going with the transition. I think you should hear from your division director about that," Daniel said. "Adrian has a perspective on the transition." "I'm asking you." Daniel looked at her. "The team is adjusting," he said carefully. "Adrian tells me there's been some resistance. Adrian and I have different interpretations of what's been happening. He says you're undermining his authority." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "I've documented every concern I've raised with him," he said. "The basis for each concern, the data supporting it, and his response. If you'd like to review that documentation, I'm happy to share it." Victoria folded her hands on the desk. "Daniel, I've known you a long time. I know you're exceptionally good at what you do. But Adrian is the future of this company. He has ideas that this division needs." "What this division needs," Daniel said with a precision that he allowed himself for the first time in that office, "is leadership that understands what took 9 years to build before it begins dismantling it." Victoria's expression changed. Not dramatically, just a slight cooling. "I hope you'll find a way to make this work," she said. "For the good of the company. For the good of the company." Daniel repeated, "I will always give you my honest professional assessment. That assessment is that the current trajectory has risks that aren't being adequately considered." "And my assessment," Victoria said with the gentle finality of a person closing a door, "is that you are having difficulty accepting change." Daniel looked at her. He saw it clearly in that moment for the first time, without any of the diplomatic filters he had always maintained. She was not interested in his assessment. She was not interested in the risk. She was not interested in the 9 years, or the relationships, or the team, or the clients. She was interested in appearing to be a visionary who had given her nephew a platform to succeed, and Daniel was supposed to make that look like it was working. "I understand," he said. He stood up. He thanked her for her time. He walked out, and in the elevator, going back down to the 22nd floor, he took out his phone and opened the document he had not sent 2 weeks ago, and he read it one more time. 3 paragraphs. Clear, professional, honest. He did not send it in the elevator, but he knew with the specific certainty that comes not from a decision, but from recognition, from finally seeing something that was already true, that he was going to. The day he sent it, it was a Thursday. Emma had a presentation at school that morning. She had been working on it for 2 weeks, a project about ocean ecosystems, with a handmade poster and 3 index cards of notes and a small model of a food chain that she had constructed out of clay and painted herself. She had practiced the presentation in the living room 3 times with Daniel as her audience, and he had given her feedback each time, and she had revised and practiced again. He drove her to school. She was nervous. She held the poster carefully so it wouldn't bend. "You're going to be great," he told her. "What if I forget what comes after the phytoplankton?" "You won't. But if you do, you take a breath, you look at your index cards, and you keep going. Forgetting one thing doesn't ruin the whole presentation." She nodded, very serious. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Are you okay? You look kind of serious." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "I'm okay, Bug. Today's just an important day." "For your work stuff?" "Yeah." She thought about that for a moment. "Are you going to be okay?" He smiled at her. "Yeah," he said. "I really am." He dropped her off and watched her carry the ocean poster carefully through the school doors, and then he drove to the office. He arrived at 7:08 a.m. Lou waved him in. He went up to the 22nd floor. He sat at his desk. He opened his email. He attached the letter. He looked at it for 30 seconds. He hit send. He stood up. He took his company badge, the one with the Meridian Technologies logo, and his name and his photo from 6 years ago, when his hair was slightly longer, and he walked to the conference room where Adrian was already sitting preparing for the morning team meeting. Adrian looked up. Daniel set the badge on the table. Not slammed. Set. Deliberately, calmly, with the quiet intention of someone who has made a decision they are entirely at peace with. "My resignation letter is in Victoria's inbox," Daniel said. "And yours. HR has been copied. I've ensured that all active project files are current and properly archived. Every client contact has current account information in the system. The team will be fine. They're excellent people. Treat them like it." Adrian stared at him. For once, he didn't say anything. Daniel looked at him for a moment. Then he looked around the room, the conference room. He had sat in hundreds of times, the whiteboard with the project timelines, the window that faced the east side of the city with the morning light coming through. He said, "You'll find out what I was worth." He picked up his coffee cup from the table, his own coffee cup, the one Emma had given him for Father's Day, the one with the slightly misshapen handle because she'd made it in art class, and he walked out. Lau was at the parking garage when Daniel came down. "Leaving early, Mr. Carter. Leaving for good, Lou." Daniel shook his hand. "It's been a genuine pleasure." Lou looked at him. "They know what they're doing letting you go." Daniel smiled. "No," he said honestly. "But they will." He got in his car. He drove to Emma's school. He sat in the parking lot, and he waited for 9:15 a.m., which was when her class's presentations were scheduled. And when the time came, he walked in and signed in at the front office and sat in the back of her classroom. Emma saw him come in, and her eyes went wide, partly surprised, partly thrilled in the specific way a 9-year-old is thrilled when their parent shows up unexpectedly for something important. When it was her turn, she walked to the front of the room with her poster and her index cards and her clay food chain model, and she stood there for a second and took a breath. She looked at her notes. She looked out at the class. Her eyes found her father at the back of the room, and she began. "The ocean is the most important ecosystem on Earth, and most people don't know how it works." Daniel sat in a small plastic chair in the back of a 4th-grade classroom and listened to his daughter explain ocean ecosystems, and he felt something that had been coiled tight in his chest for a very long time slowly begin to release. He had spent 9 years proving his value to people who were never going to fully acknowledge it. He had just decided very simply that he was done. He did not know yet what came next. He did not know about the phone calls that would come, the contracts that would fall apart, the clients who would start asking questions, the board members who would eventually want answers. He did not know about any of that yet. He just sat in the back of that classroom and watched his daughter explain the ocean, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt like himself. The day after Daniel Carter walked out of Meridian Technologies, the sun came up the same way it always did, That was the first thing he noticed. He had half expected in the irrational, exhausted way that a person expects things after making a massive decision that the morning would feel different, that the world would register the change somehow, that waking up without a company badge and a 22-floor elevator ride would produce some obvious alteration in the texture of ordinary life. It didn't. The alarm went off at 5:45. He got up. He made Emma's lunch. Diagonal cut. Orange juice. Yellow sticky note. Have a great day, Bug. I love you more than pizza. He drove her to school. She told him at length and with great indignation about a dispute she was having with her best friend Lily over the rules of a game they had apparently been playing at recess, and the injustice was vivid and immediate and completely consuming in the way that only a 9-year-old social world can be consuming. And Daniel listened to every word and asked questions and helped her think through it. And by the time they pulled up to the school doors, she had mostly talked herself to a resolution. I think I should just ask her what she actually meant, Emma decided. That's usually the move, Daniel agreed. She grabbed her backpack. Then she paused. Dad, are you going to work? He had told her something simple the night before. That he had decided to leave his job. That it was a good decision. That everything was fine. She had accepted this with the same practical matter-of-factness she brought to most adult situations, a brief focused question period, followed by apparently complete satisfaction with the answers. Not today, he said. She looked at him. What are you going to do? I'm going to figure some things out. She considered this seriously. Okay, she said. Don't forget, you said we could get that taco place for dinner. I didn't forget. The one with the chips that are warm. The one with the warm chips. I know. She got out of the car, and he watched her walk through the school doors, and then he sat in the pickup lane for a moment, after the car behind him honked, and then he pulled forward and drove home. He sat at the kitchen table. He opened his laptop. He looked at his email, which now contained a confirmation from Meridian's HR department, acknowledging receipt of his resignation. A brief and carefully worded message from Patricia that said only, I'm sorry, you deserved better, whatever you need. And 17 unread messages from the previous week that were suddenly completely beautifully irrelevant to his life. He closed the laptop. He drank his coffee. And for the first time in 9 years, he had absolutely nowhere he was required to be. The silence was harder than he expected. Not the literal silence of the house he was used to, that during work hours had always worked long days and late nights, and the house was quiet during those hours by default. It was the silence of absence, the absence of urgency, the absence of the particular constant pressure that had been so much a part of his daily existence that he had stopped feeling it as pressure and started feeling it as normal, the way a person stops hearing a sound that has been continuous long enough. Without it, he felt like a man who had been bracing against a strong wind for years, and suddenly the wind had stopped. Balanced for resistance that was no longer there. He called his sister Renee on the second day. Renee was 3 years older than Daniel and lived in Charlotte, and had spent years telling him with the direct affection of a woman who loved her brother but refused to coddle him that he was giving too much to people who didn't deserve it. Finally, she said when he told her. That's your first response. Daniel, I have been saying this for 4 years. I know. 4 years. Renee, the company needs me. Renee, I can't leave now, we have a major client transition. Renee, if I go, the whole thing falls apart. I know, Renee. And I kept saying to you, Daniel, the fact that everything falls apart if you leave is not a reason to stay. It is the reason to leave. Because a company that depends on one person's willingness to sacrifice himself indefinitely is not a company. It is a trap. You did say that. Multiple times. You were right. A brief pause. He could hear her recalibrating, stepping off the soapbox because the point had landed and there was no reason to keep making it. How are you feeling? Honestly, I feel like I'm waiting for something. I don't know what. Like the other shoe hasn't dropped yet. That's because your nervous system hasn't gotten the message that you're not in a crisis anymore. It'll take a few weeks. That's not exactly reassuring. I'm not trying to reassure you. I'm trying to be accurate. He heard her settle into a chair somewhere. What does Emma think? She thinks we're getting tacos. Renee laughed. Wise kid. She is. And what do you think, honestly? Not the version where you're fine and you have a plan and you're totally at peace with everything. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I think I'm scared, he said. Not of being unemployed. I know I can find work. I'm scared of the part where I find out how much of my identity was tied up in that building. A lot of it. Yeah. That's going to be uncomfortable. Also not reassuring. Daniel, Renee said, and her voice softened into something that was less older sister who has opinions and more the person who had been with him through everything. You raised a child by yourself while building a successful career and taking care of everyone around you and never once asking for help. You are the most capable person I know. You are going to be fine. But you have to let yourself be not fine first. He said nothing. Go get tacos, she said, and call me this weekend. He said he would. He did. Inside Meridian Technologies. The shift was not immediate. Institutions have a momentum that persists after the thing propelling them has been removed, the way a bicycle keeps moving for a distance after you stop pedaling. The projects Daniel had managed were in motion. The client relationships he had cultivated were intact at least for now. The team was still there, still experienced, still capable of doing their work. For the first 2 weeks, someone outside the organization looking at the numbers would not have seen anything wrong. But Adrian Blackthorne could feel it. He couldn't have named it precisely, because to name it precisely would have required an understanding of what it was that he didn't yet have. But he felt the difference in the room. The team was professional. They completed their deliverables. They answered his questions. But there was something absent, some quality of engagement, some frequency of voluntary contribution, some willingness to go beyond the exact boundaries of what was requested that had apparently always been present and was now simply gone. He tried to replicate what he'd observed Daniel do. During a team meeting in the 3rd week after Daniel's departure, he said, I want to make sure everyone knows my door is open. If you have concerns, bring them to me. I want to hear what's happening on the ground. The room received this statement. Nobody spoke. He looked around the table. Anyone have anything they want to share? A long, careful pause. Beverly Okafor, who had been in that building for almost 20 years, and who had an accurate internal compass for the difference between a leader who wanted honest feedback and a leader who wanted to appear to want honest feedback, said, The Hartfield Group quarterly review is coming up. The transition in account management may be something to get ahead of. Adrian looked at her. What do you mean get ahead of? Daniel had a specific relationship with their COO, Margaret Chen. They had a standing call every first Tuesday of the month. That call hasn't happened since the transition. I'll set up an introduction call with Margaret Chen. It might be worth reviewing the history of the account first. There are some sensitivities that... I'm good with client introductions, Beverly. I've done a lot of them. Beverly looked at him for a moment. Of course, she said. The meeting moved on. After it ended, Beverly walked to Patricia Graves's office, the same Patricia who had sat beside Daniel at the announcement meeting, and noticed that Adrian's posture was wrong, and she closed the door, and she sat down and said absolutely nothing for about 5 seconds. Patricia looked at her. He's going to call Margaret Chen cold, Beverly said. I know. Without reading the account history. I know. Margaret Chen almost pulled the contract 2 years ago because of a communication failure at our end. Daniel spent 3 months rebuilding that relationship. There is a very specific way she needs to be handled. I know, Beverly. Beverly looked at the ceiling. What do? We document what we've told him and when. We do our jobs, and we watch. That's it. Patricia folded her hands on her desk. We're not the ones who made this decision. We can't unmake it. What we can do is make sure that when the accounting happens, the record is clear. That feels a lot like watching someone build a fire next to the curtains. It is exactly like that, Patricia said. It is exactly like that. The call with Margaret Chen happened on a Wednesday morning. Adrian was prepared in the sense that he had read a 2-paragraph summary of the Hartfield Group account and had his standard new relationship talking points ready. He was charming, he was confident, He opened with a strong overview of his background and his vision for the partnership. Margaret Chen was polite. She asked 2 questions about the transition timeline, received answers that were technically accurate but missed the subtext of what she was actually asking. And then she said she looked forward to the quarterly review and got off the phone. 40 minutes later, Margaret Chen emailed her contact at Meridian's legal department. Not Adrian, not anyone in the operations division, but legal, asking for a copy of the current contract and the terms of the upcoming renewal window. The legal contact forwarded it to Patricia. Patricia read it and sat very still for a moment. Then she printed it out and put it in a folder and labeled the folder with the date. She did not send it to Adrian. She had tried twice to give Adrian documentation that she thought he needed. Both times he had thanked her and moved on without reading it in any meaningful way. She had learned efficiently, because Patricia was an efficient person, that the way to protect what she could protect was not to continue a conversation that wasn't happening, but to maintain a record. She opened a new folder on her computer. She labeled it Account Status Q4. She saved the email from Margaret Chen's legal inquiry. She thought about Daniel Carter and the 14-page briefing document she had seen him prepare, and that Adrian had flipped through like a magazine in a waiting room. She opened a new document. She began writing notes. Daniel, during this period, was rebuilding himself. Slowly, not linearly, not in the way that makes for a clean narrative of recovery. This week I did this, next week I did that, and look how I progressed. It was messier than that. There were days that felt like genuine progress, and days that felt like he had simply traded one set of anxieties for another. I had savings. He wasn't panicking about money, not yet. He had been careful over the years, as a single parent learns quickly that financial security is not optional, and he had a runway that gave him time to be deliberate rather than desperate. He began with the things he had not had time for. He fixed the back fence gate that had been sticking for 8 months. He reorganized Emma's bookshelf, which had evolved into a kind of geological record of every book she'd ever owned, most of which she had now outgrown. He started running again, something he had done regularly until about 3 years ago, when the mornings became too complicated, and the first week his knees made strong objections. But by the second week, something that felt almost like pleasure had begun to reassert itself. I had lunch with an old colleague named Frank Ewan, who had left Meridian 4 years ago to start his own advisory firm, and who had been telling Daniel ever since that he should come join him when he was ready. Frank sat across from Daniel at a restaurant they both liked and said, without preamble, "I heard about what happened. I'm sorry it happened the way it did." "You're not surprised." "I'm not surprised. She's always run that company on the assumption that her authority was the thing making it work. When someone like you is around, that illusion is sustainable because the results are there and she can attribute them to herself. When you're gone, the results won't be there." "The results won't be there," Frank agreed. "And then we find out what the company was actually built on." "How long do you think it takes?" Frank picked up his coffee cup. "For the cracks to show, they're already showing. For the clients to start moving, 3 to 6 months. For the board to get involved." He thought about it. "That depends on how stubborn she is." "She's very stubborn." "Then probably 12 months before anything official happens. But the damage will start well before that." Daniel was quiet. "Does that make you feel better or worse?" Frank asked. "I haven't decided yet. You're not responsible for what happens to it." "I know. You gave them every opportunity to make different decisions." "I know that too." "Then why do you look like a man who just found out someone burned down a house he used to live in?" Daniel looked at him. "Because I built that house." Frank looked back at him. Then he nodded slowly, with the understanding of a person who has built things himself. "Yeah," he said. "That makes sense." They sat with that for a moment. Then Frank said, "So, what are we doing with you?" What they did with Daniel initially was a small consulting arrangement. Frank's firm took on a struggling client, a mid-sized logistics company with serious operational dysfunction, and Daniel came in as an external advisor 3 days a week to help diagnose and stabilize the situation. He was good at it. That didn't surprise him exactly, but the ease of it surprised him. Without the weight of institutional politics and the specific exhaustion of working under people who didn't understand the work, he found that the actual problem-solving, the thing he was genuinely excellent at, felt almost effortless by comparison. He sat with the logistics company's team leads, the way he had always sat with his team, and he listened, and he asked questions, and within 2 weeks, he had a clear picture of what was broken and a practical roadmap for fixing it. The company's operations director, a no-nonsense woman named Deborah Walsh, said to him after their second session, "You're different from the consultants we usually get." "How so?" "You actually want to know what we think. Most consultants come in with the answer already and just wait for you to confirm it." "The answer is always inside the organization," Daniel said. "My job is to help you see it." Deborah looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been managed badly for long enough to recognize the alternative when they see it. "Where'd you come from before this?" "Meridian Technologies." "Why'd you leave?" Daniel thought about the phrasing for a moment. "Change in leadership structure." Deborah made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Corporate for someone who shouldn't have been promoted got promoted." "Something like that." "Their loss," she said without sentimentality. "We'll see," Daniel said. But something in him, some small and careful part that he had been protecting for weeks, believed her. Emma noticed the change in him before he did. She was a 9-year-old with a child's unfiltered perceptiveness, and she had grown up watching her father with the specific attention of a child who has always known that her parent is her primary person. She knew his moods. She knew when he was worried. She knew the particular quality of his silence when something was weighing on him. One evening, about 5 weeks after he had left Meridian, she was sitting across from him at dinner, and she stopped eating and looked at him with an expression that he recognized as her evaluating something seriously face. "You seem better," she said. "Yeah. You laugh more. At dinner. You used to be really quiet at dinner." He hadn't realized that. He thought about it now. "I didn't know you noticed." "I notice everything," she said with the simple self-assurance of a child who knows this is true. "You used to eat really fast, too, like you were going to have to go somewhere." "I was usually going to have to go somewhere." "Not anymore." "Not as much." She thought about this, turning her fork in her pasta. "Is it better not having to go somewhere?" "Go, yes and no," he said honestly. "Some parts of my old job I really liked. Solving problems. Working with my team. I miss that. But I didn't like the part where I felt like I was invisible." She frowned. "You weren't invisible. I could always see you." "I know, Bug. That's not exactly what I meant." "What did you mean?" He thought about how to say it in a way that was true without being too complicated. "You know how sometimes you work really hard on something at school and then someone else gets credit for it?" She immediately lit up with the specific indignation of someone who had direct personal experience with this exact thing. "Mia took credit for the poster." "Okay, I don't know the full Mia situation. The poster situation was a whole thing I told you. You told me some of it. I told you all of it." She pointed at him with her fork. "But yes, that's what happened to you. Something like that, for a long time." She thought about this very seriously. "That's really unfair," she said. "It is." "What did you do about it?" "Eventually I left." She nodded. "That's what I did with the poster too. I told Mrs. Henderson I was going to work alone from now on." Daniel looked at her. "And what did Mrs. Henderson say?" "She said collaboration is an important skill." Emma picked up her fork again. "But she also told Mia that taking credit for other people's work is not a good character trait." "That sounds about right." "And then I made a new poster by myself, and it was better anyway." "Good," Daniel said. She looked at him. "You're going to make a better poster too, Dad." He felt something in his chest that was too large and too many layered to fully name. He looked at his daughter, this small, serious person who had his eyes and her own particular way of seeing the world. And he thought, as he had thought many times, that every difficult thing he had ever navigated had somehow produced this person sitting across from him, telling him he was going to make a better poster. "Yeah," he said. "I am." The first sign of genuine trouble inside Meridian came in the form of a phone call that Daniel was not supposed to receive. His phone rang on a Sunday evening while he and Emma were watching a movie, and the name on the screen was Gerald Marsh. He paused the movie. He looked at the phone. He walked to the kitchen. Gerald. Daniel. Gerald Marsh had a voice that sounded like it had been built for boardrooms, deep measured, carrying an implicit weight of authority, even in casual conversation. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Family movie night. It's fine. I won't keep you long. A pause. I heard you left Meridian. A few weeks ago, yes? I also heard why. Or some version of why. Another pause. We've had some communication with the new, what is he director, the new director, Adrian Blackthorne. Yes. The word carried about 17 things in it that Gerald Marsh was too professional to say explicitly. He called to introduce himself last month. How did that go? It went as an introductory call goes when the person calling you hasn't done any meaningful preparation for it. A beat. Daniel, you and I have been doing business together for 7 years. That's right. You know what I think about the relationship we've built. I do. What I need to tell you is that I've asked our legal team to review the renewal terms on our contract, not because I want to leave, because I need to understand my options. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I understand. This is not a phone call where I'm asking you to do anything or tell me anything you shouldn't tell me. I know you're no longer with the company. This is just I wanted you to know, out of respect for the relationship. I appreciate that, Gerald. Is there anything you can tell me about the direction things are heading over there? Daniel thought very carefully about what he could and couldn't say. I think you should trust your instincts, he said. And I think you should pay attention to how the people you're dealing with respond when something goes wrong. That's always been the test. Gerald was quiet for a moment. That's helpful, he said. Indirect, but helpful. It's the best I can do. I know. Another pause. If you land somewhere new, and I have no doubt you will, I hope we have the chance to work together again. I'd like that. Take care of yourself, Daniel. You too, Gerald. He stood in the kitchen for a while after he hung up. He could hear the movie playing in the living room. Emma's occasional commentary, drifting through the comfortable, ordinary sounds of his home. I thought about how Gerald Marsh had almost pulled his contract 7 years ago, and how Daniel had flown to Chicago on a Saturday morning to sit across from him and not make excuses. He thought about what would happen when the next crisis came, whatever form it took, and Adrian Blackthorne would be the person in that room. He thought about all of the things that could not be transferred in a document or a briefing or a 14-page analysis with color-coded tabs. He went back to the living room. Who called? Emma asked, not looking up from the movie. Old colleague. Is everything okay? Yeah, he said. He sat back down beside her and picked up the remote and unpaused the movie. Everything's okay. By the time Daniel received that call from Gerald Marsh, 3 other things had happened inside Meridian Technologies that the operations division team knew about, and Adrian Blackthorne had either minimized or misunderstood. The first was the quiet departure of Marcus, the budget coordinator, who had been with the company for 14 years, and who possessed a nearly supernatural institutional knowledge of how the numbers worked and what the numbers meant. Marcus did not make his resignation dramatic. He submitted a 2-week notice, completed his handoff documentation with characteristic thoroughness, shook the hands he needed to shake, and left on a Friday afternoon with the particular composure of a person who has made a clean decision and is at peace with it. When Patricia asked him quietly over coffee on his last day what had made him choose, now he said simply, "The temperature changed. I've been in this building long enough to know what the temperature is supposed to feel like." The second was a project deadline on the Callaway Systems integration, a complex, high-visibility project that Daniel had been managing personally for 8 months and which had been in a delicate phase at the time of his departure. Daniel had handed off a complete project status document. He had briefed the project lead, a talented but relatively junior engineer named Chris, on everything that needed to happen next. But the handoff that he hadn't been able to make, the one that couldn't be documented, was the relationship management dimension. Callaway Systems had a specific set of internal politics that affected how their decision-making worked, and Daniel had learned those politics over 8 months of careful attention, and that knowledge lived nowhere except in his head. When a technical complication arose in week 6, and Chris escalated it through the new reporting structure, the response he received from Adrian was a directive to document the complication and present options at the next weekly review, which was 4 days away. Chris, who understood that 4 days was not the right answer to a complication that was currently affecting the project timeline, tried to escalate more urgently. He was told in language that was professional but firm that the reporting structure existed for a reason. By the time the next weekly review came, the complication had become a setback. By the time Adrian had reviewed the documentation and determined a course of action, Callaway Systems project lead had sent a formal communication expressing concern about the timeline. By the time that formal communication had been addressed, the project was 3 weeks behind schedule. The third thing was subtler and in some ways more damaging than either of the first two. It was simply that the team had stopped telling Adrian things, not lying, not concealing information that was formally required to be shared, just not volunteering the things they used to volunteer. The early warning that a client relationship felt slightly off. The intuition that a project was drifting toward a problem before the problem was visible in the data. The small observations that experienced people share with each other constantly in a high-functioning team, because they know that catching things early is the difference between a correction and a crisis. That information had a pathway before. It flowed through the relationships Daniel had built, through the trust he had cultivated, through the weekly debrief where people felt safe saying what they actually observed rather than what they could prove. That pathway was closed now, not because people were angry, not because they were staging any kind of organized resistance, but because they had tried in the early weeks to bring their observations to the new structure and found that the new structure either didn't hear them or heard them and moved on. So they moved on too. They did their jobs. They were professional. They showed up, completed their deliverables, attended their meetings. And they kept what they saw to themselves. And in the white space between what was documented and what was known, things began to go wrong. Victoria Blackthorne was aware that something was off. She was not a foolish person. She had not built a successful career in an unforgiving industry by being inattentive. She could see that Adrian was struggling with the pace of the work that some of his decisions had produced. Outcomes that were less clean than she would have wished, that certain names were appearing in status reports with more concerning qualifiers than they used to. What she could not do, what pride and family loyalty, and the specific cost of the public narrative she had constructed around Adrian's arrival would not allow her to do, was admit that the problem might be structural rather than circumstantial. She told herself it was a transition period. Every transition had turbulence. She told herself the team was resistant to change. Teams always resisted change. She told herself Daniel's departure had created some knowledge gaps that would naturally require time to fill. She did not tell herself the thing that was true, which was that she had elevated an unqualified person to a position of authority over one of the company's most critical divisions, displaced the person who had been holding that division together for 9 years, and then watched the thing she had refused to believe would happen begin slowly and then less slowly to happen. She called Adrian to her office on a Thursday afternoon. "Walk me through where we are on the major accounts." Adrian sat in the chair across from her desk, the same chair Daniel had sat in dozens of times, and he went through the accounts with the confidence of someone who has learned to sound confident independent of the quality of the underlying information. "Hartfield Group is solid. I've got the quarterly review coming up, and Margaret Chen and I have a good rapport." Victoria looked at him. "Have you spoken to Margaret Chen since the introductory call?" "We've emailed." "That's not the same as speaking to her." A small pause. "I'll get a call on the calendar." "Good. What about Callaway Systems?" Adrian's expression shifted slightly. It was a barely perceptible shift, a slight adjustment in the set of his jaw, and Victoria noticed it immediately because she had known him his whole life, and she knew what his almost invisible discomfort looked like. There's been some timeline friction on the integration project. We're managing it. How much friction? 3 weeks. It's a technical issue, not a relationship issue. Has the client communicated concern? They sent a formal communication. We responded. What was in the response? A project timeline adjustment and a commitment to the new delivery date. Who drafted the response? I reviewed it and approved it. That doesn't answer my question, Adrian. He met her eyes. Chris Alvarez drafted it. And is Chris Alvarez equipped to manage the Callaway Systems relationship at a senior level? Another pause longer this time. He's getting there. Victoria looked at her nephew, and for the first time without allowing it to be visible on her face, she felt the specific and deeply uncomfortable sensation of a woman who has made a serious mistake and who is not yet ready to say so out loud. I want weekly one-on-ones going forward, she said. Not status reports, actual conversations. Of course. And Adrian, she paused. I need you to read the Hartfield Group account history before the quarterly review. All of it. Not a summary. The actual account history. He nodded. After he left, Victoria sat at her desk and did not look at anything in particular for a while. She thought about Daniel Carter sitting in that same chair, telling her with precise and careful language that the current trajectory had risks that weren't being adequately considered. She thought about dismissing him as someone who was having difficulty accepting change. She thought about the Hartfield Group and Margaret Chen's email to the legal department, which she had seen a copy of through a chain she was certain Adrian was not aware she had access to. She opened her contacts. She looked at Daniel Carter's number. She looked at it for a long moment. She closed her phone. Not yet. She wasn't there yet. She was not ready yet to pick up the phone and make that call. But the division wasn't going to wait for her to be ready. The Callaway Systems situation deteriorated faster than the adjusted timeline had projected. The technical complication that Chris had flagged and that Adrian had routed through the weekly review process turned out to have downstream implications that nobody had mapped, because the person who would have mapped them, the person who understood the project architecture well enough to anticipate second-order effects, was sitting in a home office 40 minutes away, helping a logistics company sort out their operations. When Callaway Systems' executive team requested a meeting with Meridian's senior leadership to discuss the project status. Adrian walked into that meeting with a project status deck and confident body language, and the kind of preparation that is mostly about presentation rather than content. The Callaway Systems EVP, a man named Robert Alcott, who had been doing deals for 30 years and who had a 30-year refined ability to tell the difference, asked 4 questions. After the 4th question, he looked at Adrian for a moment and then said very calmly, "Who is currently managing this account at your end?" Adrian said, "I am as Executive Director of Operations." "And before you, Daniel Carter." "Is Daniel available for a brief conversation? I had a strong relationship with him, and I think it would be..." "Daniel is no longer with the company." The room temperature dropped approximately 3 degrees. Robert Alcott nodded once slowly, with the expression of a man filing a significant piece of information. "I see," he said. The meeting continued. It produced commitments and timelines and professional language on both sides. And that evening, Robert Alcott called his account manager and said, "Start a file on alternatives. We're not moving yet, but I want options ready." Patricia Graves found out about the Alcott meeting from Chris, who found out from someone in scheduling, and she added it to the folder on her computer, which was now 17 pages of notes, emails, and documented events. She picked up her phone. She didn't call Daniel. That wasn't the right move, and she knew it. She called her lawyer instead. Not because she was planning anything dramatic, but because she was a careful person, and careful people, when they are watching something burn, make sure their own paperwork is in order. That evening, she sat in her car in the parking garage, and she thought about Beverly's phrase from weeks ago, watching someone build a fire next to the curtains, and she thought about how accurate it had been. The fire was going. The curtains were catching. And the man who knew where the extinguisher was had walked out 6 weeks ago and was somewhere across the city, having dinner with his daughter, probably finally sleeping through the night. She thought about whether to call him. She decided for now not to, not because it wasn't time, But because the kind of call she wanted to make, the real one, the honest one, needed to be made when things were further along. When the record was complete. When the situation had developed enough that the conversation could be fully honest rather than partially protective. She started the car. She drove home. And the division that Daniel Carter had spent 9 years building kept burning through the night. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in February, 4 months after Daniel Carter had set his badge on a conference room table and walked out of Meridian Technologies for the last time. He was in the middle of a working session with Deborah Walsh at the logistics company when his phone buzzed. He glanced at it. Unknown number with a New York area code. He let it go to voicemail. 20 minutes later, when the session wrapped and Deborah had walked out talking to her project lead about the new routing system, Daniel picked up his phone and listened. The voice on the voicemail belonged to a man named Stuart Hale. He introduced himself as a partner at an independent governance consulting firm. He said he had been engaged by a client whose interests he wasn't yet at liberty to name. He said he understood that Daniel Carter was the former director of operations at Meridian Technologies. He said he would very much appreciate 15 minutes of Daniel's time at Daniel's earliest convenience. Daniel listened to the voicemail twice. Then he called Frank. Stuart Hale, Frank said immediately without any pause to think. Governance and board advisory. Serious firm. If he's calling you, it means the board is moving. Which board? How many boards do you have unhappy clients with? Daniel was quiet. Meridian's board is asking questions, Frank said. That's what it means. Someone commissioned an outside review, and they found you, and they want to understand the picture before they decide what to do about it. What do I tell him? The truth. You have nothing to hide. Everything you did when you left was clean. You told me that yourself. It was completely clean. Then talk to him. What are you worried about? Daniel thought about it. Not about the conversation with Stuart Hale specifically, but about the larger shape of things. About the fact that 4 months ago he had walked away from a situation that he had spent years trying quietly and without drama to prevent from going wrong. And now the wrong had happened, and people were circling, and his name was apparently in the center of whatever circle they were drawing. I'm not worried, he said. I just wanted to think out loud for a minute. You thought out loud for about 4 seconds. That's usually enough. Call Hale back, Frank said, and let me know what he says. Stuart Hale turned out to be a compact, precise man in his late 50s who wore very good suits and spoke with the measured economy of someone who charged by the hour and had internalized the value of not wasting time. He came to Daniel's home office, a small organized space that Daniel had set up in the spare room with a whiteboard along one wall and Emma's school picture on the desk facing him, and he sat down and placed a thin leather notebook on the table and looked at Daniel with the specific quality of attention that indicated he had done considerable homework before walking through the door. I appreciate you making time. Of course. I'll be direct with you about what I can share. I've been engaged by members of Meridian's board to conduct an independent assessment of the operations division's performance trajectory over the past several quarters. My client has expressed concern about a pattern of client relationship deterioration and internal team instability. My role is to understand what happened when and why. And you want my perspective. I want your perspective, yes. I also want to be clear that you are not the subject of this assessment. Based on everything I've reviewed so far, your conduct during your tenure and at the time of your departure was fully professional and compliant with your obligations to the company. It was. What I'm trying to understand is the decision-making environment. The circumstances that led to the current situation. I've spoken to a number of current and former employees. I've reviewed documentation. What I don't yet have is the internal narrative, what it looked like from the inside to the person who was closest to it. Daniel looked at him. What specific areas are you looking at? The Callaway Systems account, the Hartfield Group renewal, the departure pattern of senior staff over the past 4 months, and the circumstances around your own departure. Those 4 things are connected. I suspected they were. Will you walk me through it? Daniel leaned back in his chair. He thought about what he wanted to say and what he was willing to say, and whether there was any meaningful distance between those 2 things. He decided there wasn't. Yes, he said. I'll walk you through it. He talked for 2 hours. He was precise. He was specific. He did not editorialize. He did not characterize people's motivations beyond what the documented record supported. He described the decision chain, the warnings he had given, the responses he had received, the things he had tried, and the point at which he had determined that the attempt was no longer productive. Stuart Hale took notes with a pen that moved quickly and steadily and never seemed to stop. At the end of 2 hours, he put the pen down. One more question, he said. And I want you to understand, this is not a setup I'm asking, because the board will ask it, and I want to have your answer in the record. Go ahead. Did you take any clients, any proprietary information, or any personnel with you when you left? No. Did you have contact with active clients after your departure? Gerald Marsh called me unsolicited approximately 3 weeks after I left. He wanted me to know that he had asked his legal team to review the Hartfield Group contract renewal terms. I told him I couldn't discuss internal company matters and encouraged him to trust his own judgment about the relationship. That's all. That's all. Stuart Hale picked up his pen again and wrote something. Then he closed his notebook and looked at Daniel. You could have taken that contract with you. Yes. Why didn't you? Daniel thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without sounding like he was performing virtue. Because it wasn't mine to take, he said. I spent 9 years building that relationship on behalf of the company. Walking out the door doesn't make it mine. And Gerald Marsh deserved to make his own decision about what was in his interest, not be pulled into my situation. Stuart Hale looked at him for a moment. Then he said, Thank you for your time, Mr. Carter. He stood up. He shook Daniel's hand. He left. Daniel sat in his home office for a while after that, not looking at anything in particular. He heard Emma in the kitchen making herself a snack. The sound of the refrigerator opening and closing, and a cabinet, and what was probably a bowl hitting the counter. Normal sounds. House sounds. The sounds of an ordinary afternoon that had nothing to do with board assessments or governance consultants, or the slow unraveling of a company he had spent 9 years building. He got up and went to the kitchen. Emma was eating cereal at the counter because it was 3:30 in the afternoon, and apparently cereal was a reasonable snack choice, and he had decided years ago that this particular battle wasn't worth fighting. How was school? We did a math test. I think I did good. Well, I think I did well. She pointed at him. You're going to correct me every time, aren't you? Every single time. She rolled her eyes in the affectionate, fully performed way of a child who has decided this is their designated response to this specific parental behavior. Who was the man in the suit? A business meeting. About your old job. Related to it. She thought about this eating her cereal. Is something going to happen? Things are already happening, he said. They've been happening for a while. I'm just not sure yet what the ending looks like. Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to complicated things. Do you know what I think? Tell me. I think you're the kind of person where the ending always works out, because you do things the right way. Daniel looked at his daughter. Where did you get that from? Grandma says it, she said. She says people who do things the right way don't always get the right outcome right away, but they always get it eventually. She says the people who cheat the right way are the ones who have to worry. Grandma says cheat the right way. She means cheat the system, like doing bad stuff and getting away with it. She says those people always end up... Emma squinted, trying to remember the exact phrase. She says they always end up holding the bag. Holding the bag. Yeah. Daniel smiled. Grandma's pretty smart. She's very smart. She says you got your patience from her. She's right about that too. Emma finished her cereal and put the bowl in the sink and went back to her room, trailing the comfortable noise of an after-school afternoon. Daniel stood at the kitchen counter and thought about his mother, who was 81 years old and still sharp, and who had raised him on the specific principle that doing things the right way was not about rewards. It was about who you got to be when you looked in the mirror. He had always believed that. He still believed it. I was about to find out whether the world believed it too. Inside Meridian Technologies, the governance review was not yet public. Stuart Hale's firm operated with the discretion that justified their fees, and the board members who had commissioned the assessment had done so quietly without notifying Victoria. This was not a minor decision. Choosing to conduct a governance review without informing the CEO was the kind of move that board members made when they had already begun to lose confidence and were building a record before having the direct conversation. Victoria found out through a channel she should not have found out through, which meant someone on the board had a divided loyalty that was itself telling. When she found out, she called an emergency meeting with her general counsel. They don't have the authority to conduct an external review without notifying leadership. Her general counsel, a steady woman named Carol Stanton, who had been with the company for 12 years, looked at her carefully. They do, actually. Under the governance provisions in the charter, the board has the independent authority to commission performance assessments without executive notification when the assessment relates to division-level performance that may have material impact on shareholders. This is retaliation for my personnel decisions. Victoria. It's exactly that. I made a restructuring decision they didn't like, and now they're building a case. Carol was quiet for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "Would it be useful to review what the assessment might find, so we understand the landscape before we're in the room with them?" The room was quiet. "Pull together the division performance metrics for the last 6 months, Victoria said. Everything. Client retention, project completion, revenue, staff turnover. I want to see what they're looking at." Carol left. Victoria sat alone at her desk. She was not a person who panicked. Panic was expensive and unproductive, and she had trained herself over decades of executive life to encounter bad news the way a doctor encounters a difficult diagnosis, with the clinical distance necessary to assess and act rather than react and spiral. But something else was happening now. Something underneath the professional response. She had called the board's action retaliation. She had said it firmly in the tone of a person stating a fact, and even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. She knew exactly what the assessment was going to find. Not because she had admitted it to herself exactly, but because there is a layer of knowing that lives below the level of admission, the place where facts are stored before a person is ready to look at them directly, and Victoria Blackthorne had a very full fact storage system at the moment. She knew about the Callaway system setback. She knew about Margaret Chen's legal inquiry, which had not been resolved, and which the quarterly review had not fully addressed, because Adrian had walked into that meeting underprepared, and Margaret Chen was a professional and hadn't said anything directly, but also hadn't given the warmth that she always used to give. She knew that 3 of the division's 7 senior staff had left in the past 4 months, and that the reason on all 3 exit interviews was some variation of seeking new opportunities, which was exit interview language for something more specific that nobody wanted to put on a form. She knew the project completion rate for Q4 had dropped from 94% to 78%. She knew all of it. She had told herself each time a piece of it landed that it was transition noise, that organizations went through adjustment periods, that the trajectory would correct. Sitting at her desk alone with a governance review in progress and her general counsel pulling metrics. In the next room, she stopped telling herself that. She let herself sit with what she actually knew. The division was in trouble. Not catastrophically, not yet. But the trajectory was wrong. And the longer the trajectory stayed wrong, the harder the correction became. She thought about Daniel Carter's 14-page briefing document, which she had never read, but which Adrian had mentioned once in a dismissive tone that had told her everything she needed to know about whether he'd read it either. She thought about Daniel sitting in her office saying, "The problem is that you believe the company belongs to one person." She thought about dismissing him as someone resistant to change. She picked up her phone. She looked at Daniel's number. This time she didn't close it. But she still didn't call. Not yet. There was one move she needed to make first. Adrian Blackthorne had not been told about the governance review. He found out the way Daniel had found out about things inside Meridian, through the informal network, through a conversation that should not have reached him, but did. In his case, it was an assistant overhearing something she should not have overheard, and telling someone she should not have told. He came to Victoria's office that afternoon without being called. "I need to talk to you." Victoria looked up from her desk. "Close the door." He closed it. He sat down. "Tell me this review is not what I think it is." "What do you think it is?" "I think it's the board deciding my decisions in the division are the problem and building a case to remove me." Victoria looked at her nephew. 26 years old. Expensive suit. Smart, genuinely smart, in the way that people who have been given every advantage of education can be smart, well-read, analytically capable, articulate, unprepared for this moment in ways that no amount of intelligence or education could have fully prevented, because the preparation for this moment came from experience, and experience could not be accelerated by willpower or family connection. "The board has concerns about division performance," she said. "The review is standard process." "It's not standard process. Standard process doesn't happen without notifying the CEO." "Adrian, they're going to pin this on me." He leaned forward. "Aunt Vicky, they're going to use this to undo everything you built. They never agreed with the restructuring. They thought Daniel leaving was going to be a disaster, and they're looking for evidence to say they were right." Victoria was quiet. The specific quality of her quiet, not reassuring, not dismissive, registered with Adrian in a way that the content of any sentence she might have said would not have. "You think they're right," he said. "I think," Victoria said, choosing each word with the care of a person navigating a field she knows is mined, "that the transition has been more difficult than I anticipated." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." He looked at her. For the first time since he had walked into Meridian Technologies in his expensive suit with his MBA and his confidence, and his aunt's promise of a platform, Adrian Blackthorne looked like a 26-year-old who was in over his head and was beginning to understand it. "What do I do?" Victoria looked at him, and in that look was the full complexity of a woman who loved her nephew and had put him in an impossible position and was now navigating the consequences in real time. "For right now," she said, "you do your job. You prepare properly for the Hartfield Quarterly Review. You get on a call with Robert Alcott at Callaway Systems before the end of the week. Not a junior call, a senior call, you personally. You review the account files, all of them." "I reviewed all of them, Adrian. Not summaries, not briefing notes. The actual account histories and relationship documentation." He was quiet. "And the Callaway Timeline Recovery Plan. I want to see a draft by Thursday." "I can have that." "Realistic draft, not optimistic. What you can actually deliver." He nodded. "You're going to be honest with me when I read it?" "Yes." Another pause. "Aunt Vicky." He stopped, started again. "Is there any chance that bringing Daniel back could help? Even as a consultant, just for the transition period?" The word hung in the room. Victoria said nothing for a long moment. "Let me worry about Daniel Carter," she said, which was the closest she had come in any conversation with anyone to acknowledging that Daniel Carter was the next call she needed to make. Daniel was at Frank's office when Beverly called him. He almost didn't answer for the same reasons he'd almost not answered. Gerald Marsh. The careful instinct of a person who knows that certain conversations should have a boundary between his old life and his current one. But Beverly's name on his screen was Beverly's name, and there were people from the old world whose calls he was always going to pick up. "Beverly. Daniel, I'm calling on my personal phone, not the company line. I want to be clear about that." "I understand." "I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm not speaking for the company. I'm calling as your colleague of 9 years, and I'm going to tell you something that I think you should know." "Okay." He heard her take a breath. He could picture her sitting in her car, probably in the parking garage, the specific place people went at Meridian when they needed to have a conversation that wasn't on the record. "Patricia and I have been documenting everything since you left. The decisions, the outcomes, the client communications, the staff departures. We have a 17-page account. We gave it to a governance reviewer who has been here for the past week." Stuart Hale. A pause. "You already knew?" "He came to see me too." "Then you know what's coming." "I have a sense of it. The Hartfield Quarterly Review is next Wednesday. It's going to be bad." Her voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness was something that sounded like exhaustion. Margaret Chen is coming in person. She has not done that before. She always participates by video. When a client comes in person to a quarterly review without being specifically asked, it means they're there to make a decision. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He thought about Gerald Marsh sitting across a table in Chicago. He thought about the specific body language of a client who has decided to leave but is giving one last meeting out of a sense of professional decency. He knew exactly what Margaret Chen showing up in person meant. Beverly. Yeah. You and Patricia, you've done the right thing. Everything you've done. I want you to know that. A pause. It doesn't feel like enough. It is. You documented the truth. You gave it to the right people. What happens next isn't in your hands. Daniel, what happens next might end up being in your hands. He was quiet. If the board moves on this, and I think they're going to move, someone is going to call you, and I don't know what you're going to say when they do. I don't have any right to tell you what to say, but I wanted you to know the team is still here. Most of us. The ones who stayed because we believe in what we built, not because we believe in what it's become. And if there's any version of this where it comes back... She stopped herself. That's all I wanted to say. Beverly. Yeah. Get some sleep. He heard something that might have been a small laugh. You get some sleep? She said. Something tells me you're going to need it more than I do in the next few weeks. The Hartfield Group quarterly review happened on a Wednesday. Margaret Chen arrived in person as Beverly had predicted. She was a 60-year-old woman with the specific authority of someone who had been running operations at a major company for 20 years and who communicated entirely without raising her voice or using aggressive language. The complete absence of patience for being managed rather than dealt with directly. She sat across the conference room table from Adrian Blackthorne and two of his team leads, and she was professional. She was cordial. She asked clear questions, and she waited for the answers. She got 3 answers that were accurate, 4 that were partially accurate, and 2 that reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the Hartfield Group's operational relationship with Meridian. She wrote nothing down. She didn't need to. After the formal review, Adrian walked her to the elevator in the way that had been Daniel's custom, the small professional courtesy of escorting a senior client, making those 2 minutes into a final impression rather than a logistical necessity. In the elevator lobby, Margaret Chen paused and turned to face him directly. Mr. Blackthorne, she said with the directness of a person who has decided that clarity is the kindest thing she can offer. How long have you been in your current role? A little over 4 months. She nodded. And before this role, what operations management experience did you have? A pause, slight, but there. I completed my MBA with a concentration in operations management. I had a graduate internship with... I understand your educational background, she said, not unkindly, with the precision of someone removing something unnecessary from a sentence. I'm asking about operations management experience, managing teams, client relationships, active projects. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. She looked at him across the threshold. Tell Victoria I'll be in touch, she said. It was nice to meet you. The doors closed. Adrian stood in the lobby of the 22nd floor and felt perhaps for the first time in his professional life the specific and clarifying experience of being seen completely accurately by someone who had absolutely no incentive to spare his feelings. He went back to his office. He closed the door. He sat down. He pulled up the Hartfield Group account history file, the full one. The one he had been told to read and had read in the way that a person reads something when they already believe they don't need it. And he started at the beginning. He read for 3 hours. He read about the original contract negotiation, about the near termination 2 years ago and what Daniel had done to prevent it, about the specific nature of Margaret Chen's management philosophy and what she needed from a partner relationship, about the 18 months of twice-monthly calls, the careful tracking of every deliverable and every communication, the documented instances where Daniel had caught a misalignment early enough to correct it before it became visible. He read about a relationship that had taken 7 years to build and that he had managed for 4 months in the way that someone manages something they believe is already established and requires only maintenance. He closed the file. He picked up the phone and called his aunt. "She's going to leave." Victoria's voice when she answered was the voice of a person who has been waiting for a specific phone call and had prepared themselves for it without fully preparing themselves for it. "Tell me what happened," he told her. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Adrian, I want you to take some time tonight to think about this honestly, not defensively, not about who's responsible or what should have been different. Just honestly, about whether you are in the right position to solve what's currently broken." A long pause. "Are you asking me if I should step down? I'm asking you to think honestly about what the division needs right now." He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than she had heard it since he was much younger before the MBA and the suits and the platform she had given him. "I don't think I'm the person to fix it," he said. "I think I'm part of what broke it." The line was quiet. "That's honest," Victoria said. "I should have listened to him more," Adrian said. "I kept thinking he was resistant to change, but he wasn't resistant to change. He was resistant to damage." Another silence. "I know," Victoria said. The board called an emergency meeting on Friday. Stuart Hale presented his findings. 47 pages. Specific, documented, measured in tone. The kind of report that was more damaging for what it didn't editorialize than for what it said directly. The numbers said what numbers said when a business unit had lost institutional knowledge, client trust, and internal team cohesion over a 4-month period. The board members listened. They asked questions. Hale answered them. Then the board chair, a methodical 70-year-old named Howard Cross, who had been on the Meridian board for 8 years, and who communicated through the careful economy of a person who had learned that precision was its own form of power. Power looked at Victoria across the table. "What's your assessment of the current situation?" Victoria looked at the 17 people on the call. She had been thinking since Adrian's phone call 2 nights ago about what she was going to say in this moment. She had thought about the various forms of professional self-protection available to her. The ways to frame a bad situation in better terms. The language that preserved authority while acknowledging difficulty. She had thought about all of that. And then she had thought about Daniel sitting in her office calm and precise, telling her things she hadn't wanted to hear. And then she had thought about the fact that she had for 9 years run a company on the work of a person she never adequately valued, and it had taken losing him to understand what she had been doing. She could keep doing the professional self-protection thing. She was very good at it. Or she could try something she had not tried often enough. "The current situation," she said to the 17 faces looking at her, "is the result of a decision I made that prioritized a personal obligation over professional judgment. I moved a family member into a role for which he was not yet qualified at the expense of a division leader who was among the best operational executives this company has had. I was warned directly and with documentation that the decision carried serious risks. I dismissed those warnings. What you're looking at in Stuart's report is the consequence of that decision." The room was quiet. Howard Cross looked at her for a moment. "What do you propose to do about it?" "I intend to contact Daniel Carter," Victoria said, "and I intend to ask him directly and honestly for whatever form of help he is willing to provide. I don't know yet what that looks like. I know that whatever it looks like, it will be on his terms." Another silence. "And Adrian. Adrian will be moving to a different role within the organization. One that reflects his current level of experience rather than the level I prematurely placed him at. That is my decision to make, and I've already discussed it with him." He agreed. "He suggested it himself," Victoria said. "Which I'll tell you honestly is the thing that gives me the most hope about him. He's smart. He just needed more time to be ready for that particular weight. I should have given him that time." Howard Cross was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Make the call," he said. She called that afternoon. Daniel was at his kitchen table reviewing a proposal for a new consulting client when his phone rang. The name on the screen was Victoria Blackthorne. He had known this call was coming. He'd been certain of it since Stuart Hale's visit, since Beverly's parking garage phone call, since the accumulated logic of the situation had made the destination obvious, even if the route was still uncertain. He picked it up on the third ring. Victoria. Daniel. A pause. I owe you a conversation. You do? Can I come to you? I'd rather do this in person. He thought about that. He thought about his home office where Emma's school picture sat on the desk and the whiteboard had notes from his current consulting work. He thought about whether he wanted Victoria Blackthorne in that space. He decided he didn't. There's a coffee place 3 blocks from the Meridian Tower, he said. I'll meet you there tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. A brief pause. I'll be there, she said. After he hung up, he sat for a while. He thought about everything that had happened in the 4 months since he'd walked out. The logistics company work, the dinners without emergency calls, Emma's ocean ecosystem presentation, Gerald Marsh's Sunday phone call, Stuart Hale's careful questions, Beverly's voice in a parking garage telling him the team was still there. I thought about the fact that he had spent 9 years building something that had taken 4 months to show everyone what it was actually built on. He didn't feel vindicated exactly. That wasn't the word. There was no pleasure in having been right about the damage, because he had liked the people in that building, and he did not enjoy watching things he had built fall apart. What he felt was something closer to clarity. He knew what he was worth. He had always known. The question now was what he was willing to do about it, and for whom, and on what terms. He got up from the table. Emma's backpack was in the hallway, dropped exactly where she always dropped it, despite 9 years of reminders not to drop it there. He stepped over it on his way to the kitchen, the way he always stepped over it, and he shook his head and smiled the way he always smiled, and he started thinking about what to make for dinner. Tomorrow he would sit across from Victoria Blackthorne and listen to what she had to say. Tonight he was making dinner. The two things had equal weight, and he understood now in a way he hadn't fully understood 4 months ago why they needed to. The coffee place was a small, unremarkable spot that Daniel had been going to for years, not because it was exceptional, but because it was honest. Good coffee, no pretension. The kind of place where people came to actually talk, rather than to be seen talking. He arrived at 8:52 and ordered his usual, and sat at a corner table facing the door. Victoria walked in at exactly 9 o'clock. He had seen her in boardrooms and on stages and at company galas, always in the particular armor of a CEO posture presence. The carefully constructed impression of someone who owned whatever room they were standing in. She still had that posture. She still had that presence. But something underneath it was different, and Daniel noticed it the moment she walked through the door, the way a person who has spent years reading rooms notices things that don't announce themselves. She looked tired. Not physically tired, although probably that too. She looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been carrying something they should have put down earlier and are only now beginning to feel the full weight of it. She saw him. She crossed the room. She sat down. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The coffee place moved around them, the sound of the espresso machine, a brief exchange between the barista and another customer, the ordinary ambient noise of a Tuesday morning. "Thank you for coming," Victoria said. "You said you owed me a conversation. I think that's accurate." She looked at him directly. He gave her credit for that. She didn't look away, didn't do the thing that people sometimes did when they owed an apology, which was to look slightly to the side of the person they were apologizing to, as if direct eye contact was too much accountability to maintain. "I handled this wrong," she said. "Not just in the end, from the beginning. I used your division as a platform for something that had nothing to do with the division's interests, and I dismissed your concerns when you raised them, and I told myself a story about why I was right to do that." A pause. "I was not right." Daniel said nothing. He let the words sit where they had been placed. "The board has commissioned an independent review," she continued. "I'm sure you're aware of that. I spoke with Stuart Hale." "Then you know what it found." "I know what I told him, what it found that's between you and the board." She looked at him. "It found exactly what you warned me it would find." He nodded once carefully. "Daniel, I'm here to ask for your help. I want to be honest about what that means and what I'm offering, and I want to hear whatever you need to say before we get to any of that. What do you mean, whatever I need to say? I mean that you have every right to sit across this table and tell me what this cost you, professionally, personally. You have every right to be angry, and if you need to say that before this becomes a business conversation, I'm listening. He looked at her. He thought about whether he was angry. He had been at certain points. Not the hot, immediate kind of anger, but the slower, more erosive kind, the anger of someone who has been consistently undervalued by someone who should have known better. He had felt it in the parking garage elevator on the day she'd told him he was having difficulty accepting change. He had felt it driving home that night. He had felt versions of it in the weeks after he left, in the quiet moments when Emma was asleep and the house was completely still. But sitting across from Victoria now, he found that the anger had mostly burned through. What was left was something more complicated and less combustible. "I don't need to tell you what it cost me," he said. "You know what it cost me, and honestly, some of what it cost me turned out to be worth paying." She looked slightly surprised by that. "Emma saw me at dinner every night for 4 months. I went to her school presentations. I slept 8 hours. He picked up his coffee cup. "I had forgotten those were possible, so I'm not going to sit here and tell you my life was ruined. It wasn't. But what happened at that company, what you let happen, that cost other people things they didn't choose to pay. Beverly and Patricia, who stayed and tried to hold things together. Marcus, who left. Chris Alvarez, who was put in situations he wasn't equipped for because the person who should have been managing them had been replaced by someone who wasn't ready. Gerald Marsh, who built a 7-year partnership in good faith and then found himself wondering whether it was built on sand. Those are the people the cost landed on." Victoria held his gaze through all of that. "You're right," she said. "All of it. I know I'm right." A pause. "So," he said, "tell me what you're asking." She set both hands on the table, a gesture that was uncharacteristically unguarded for her. "I want you to come back. Your role, your title, full authority over the division. Salary increase, a significant one, to reflect what I should have been paying you for the last 3 years. A formal acknowledgement in writing from the board that the division's success was built on your leadership. And a public statement internal to the company. I mean that corrects the record on how the restructuring decision happened and why it was wrong." Daniel was quiet. "Adrian is moving to a junior role," she continued. "He agreed to it himself, which I'll tell you surprised me and also made me prouder of him than I was when he walked in 4 months ago with every external marker of success. He's going to be fine. He needs time that I didn't give him. But the division needs someone who doesn't need time. It needs you." Daniel looked at his coffee cup. He thought about Beverly's voice in the parking garage. "The team is still there. The ones who stayed, stayed because we believe in what we built." He thought about Gerald Marsh saying, "If you land somewhere new, I hope we have the chance to work together again." He thought about Robert Alcott asking Adrian if Daniel was available and being told Daniel was no longer with the company, and the way the room temperature had reportedly dropped 3 degrees. He thought about Patricia's 17-page folder of documented events, kept not as a weapon, but as a record of truth. He thought about what it would mean to walk back into that building, not as the person who had quietly carried things for 9 years, hoping that eventually the right people would see it, as something different, as someone who had left and been proven right in the most painful and public way possible, and who was now being asked to return on terms that finally reflected what the work had always been worth. He thought about what his father would say. "The world will take what you let it take. The trick is knowing what you can't afford to give. There are conditions," he said. "Name them. Not a list of perks, structural conditions, the way the division runs. Tell me." Authority matches responsibility. I'm not managing outcomes. I don't have the authority to make decisions about. If I'm leading the division, I lead the division. Clear reporting line to the board, not just to your office, so that if there is ever again a situation where my professional judgment is being overridden by a personnel decision made above me, I have a direct channel to raise it. Victoria nodded slowly. The team debrief structure comes back. The collaborative model, not the hierarchical reporting model. That system caught problems before they became crises for 9 years. It works. Agreed. Beverly Okafor and Patricia Graves get formal recognition and compensation adjustments. They held things together when they didn't have to. That doesn't go unrewarded. Done. And the public statement you mentioned, the internal one. I want to be involved in drafting it, not because I need it to say flattering things about me, because I want it to tell the truth about what happened clearly enough that it can't be softened into something that doesn't actually say anything. That's the only version of that statement I'm willing to have my name connected to. Victoria looked at him. That's going to be an uncomfortable document for me. Yes, Daniel said. It is. She was quiet for a moment. Agreed, she said. One more thing. Okay, I'm not coming back to save the company for you. I'm coming back because the people in that building deserve better than what the last 4 months have been, and because I believe the work matters. If at any point you decide again that the work matters less than the narrative around it. He looked at her steadily. I'll leave again. And the next time will be faster, and the announcement will be public, and I won't be sitting in a coffee shop 3 weeks later ready to have a conversation about it. The room moved around them. The espresso machine. The other customers. The ordinary Tuesday morning. Victoria Blackthorne, 61 years old. CEO of a billion-dollar company. A woman who had not been spoken to that directly in a professional setting. In a very long time looked at Daniel Carter and said, "Understood." "Then we have a deal," Daniel said. She put her hand across the table. He shook it. He didn't tell Emma immediately. He needed a day to sit with the decision himself, not to second-guess it, but to make sure the version of it that felt right in the coffee place still felt right when he was in his kitchen making dinner and the initial charge of the conversation had settled into the ordinary air of his house. It did. He told her the next evening after dinner when she was doing homework at the kitchen table and he sat down across from her with the specific intention of having a real conversation. She looked up from her worksheet. "Your old company," she said. "Yeah. The one with the Nephew guy." "That's the one." She thought about this, chewing on the end of her pencil in the way she did when she was processing something. "Why? Because the people I built it with are still there. And because the situation changed." "Changed how?" "The person who made the bad decision admitted she made a bad decision, and she's willing to do things differently." Emma considered this with great seriousness. "How do you know she means it?" "I don't. Not completely. But she said the right things, and she agreed to the right conditions, and at some point you have to decide whether a person deserves a chance to do better. What if she doesn't do better? Then I leave again. Just like that. Just like that. Because now I know I can." He leaned his elbows on the table. "That's the part that changed Bug, not them. Me. I know now what I'm worth and what I need to be able to do the work right. And I know that I can walk away when those things aren't being respected. I didn't know that before." Emma looked at him for a long moment. "You seem different when you talk about it," she said. "Different how?" "Before, when you talked about your job, you always looked kind of tired. Even when you were saying good things about it, like you were carrying something." She put her pencil down. "You don't look tired now. You look like yourself." He looked at his daughter. "When did you get so perceptive?" "I've always been perceptive," she said with complete sincerity. "You just don't notice because you're a dad, and dads have a blind spot about their kids." He laughed, a real one from the chest. "That's fair. So you're going back?" "I'm going back." She nodded, accepting this, and picked up her pencil. "Okay, but we still get Friday dinners." "Always." "With the warm chip tacos." "With the warm chip tacos, I promise." She went back to her homework satisfied, and Daniel sat at the table for another minute, watching her work, feeling the strange and specific gratitude of a person who has been through something difficult and come out the other side with the right things intact.
Done.
He called Beverly first. It was 7:30 in the evening, and she picked up on the second ring, which told him she had been waiting for the call. "I'm coming back," he said. A silence. Then she made a sound that was not quite a word. something between relief and the particular emotion of someone who has been holding something tightly for a long time and is now allowed to set it down. When, she finally managed. 2 weeks. I need to wrap up the consulting commitment I have and do the transition properly. Daniel. Her voice was steadier now. The Hartfield Review, Margaret Chen. I know. I'll call her this week, personally. She's going to pull the contract. She might. I can't guarantee she won't. But I can guarantee that when I call her, she's going to talk to the right person and she's going to get an honest conversation instead of a managed one. That's all I can offer her. Beverly was quiet for a moment. She always liked you. I always liked her. She's good at her job and she doesn't tolerate being handled, which is actually the kind of client I prefer. A small sound that might have been a laugh. Patricia's going to want to call you. Tell her to call me. And Beverly, what you and Patricia did. The documentation, the board review. You did that when nobody asked you to, when the easier thing would have been to keep your heads down and get through the day. We just told the truth. That's not as simple as it sounds. Not in those situations. I know that, and I want you to know I know it. A pause. Will it be different? She asked. Actually different, not just new promises. I have it in writing that the structure changes. Clear authority, direct board reporting channel. The debrief comes back. The debrief, she said, and he could hear the relief in those 2 words specifically. Good. God, we missed the debrief. I know. Information just disappeared. Things that used to get caught in that room, they just fell through. We'd find out about something when it was already a problem instead of a warning sign. That's changing, starting week 1. She took a breath. Okay, good. She paused. And Adrian. He moved to a different role, one that fits where he actually is right now. How'd he take it? From what I understand, he suggested it himself. Another pause. Huh, Beverly said. Maybe there's hope for him. There's always hope for people who can tell the truth about themselves. That's a harder thing than it sounds. After he got off the phone with Beverly, he sat for a while before calling Patricia. He was thinking about the specific shape of what he was returning to. Not the same thing he had left, because the same thing no longer existed. The Callaway Systems project was behind schedule. The Hartfield Group was in an uncertain place. 3 senior staff members had left. Marcus was gone. The team that remained was good, but they were bruised, and bruised people needed a particular kind of leadership, the kind that acknowledged what had happened without dwelling in it, that looked forward while being honest about where things currently stood. I knew how to do that. He had done it 9 years ago with a division that was in far worse shape than this one. He called Patricia. She answered with, "Tell me it's good news." "It's good news." "Okay." A pause. "Okay. What are the terms?" Full authority, clear board channel, the debrief structure restored, and a formal correction of the record on what happened. Victoria agreed to all of that. In writing. The sound of someone who was cautiously not fully reassured. And you trust it. I trust it enough to go back. I don't trust it enough to go back as if the last 4 months didn't happen. That's why I have it in writing. The board is going to be watching. The board commissioned the review. They already have the record. I don't need them to watch the structure I negotiated. Means that if something starts going sideways, I have a path to raise it before it becomes a crisis. Patricia was quiet for a moment. You know, she said, when you left I thought the smart play was to make sure my paperwork was in order. Just protect myself, document the truth, and wait. That was the smart play. I didn't know what waiting would look like. Whether it would be worth it. Whether the right thing would actually happen, or whether the board would just make it smooth and nothing would really change. Things are going to change. How can you be sure? Because the cost of them not changing is now visible to everyone who needed to see it in the most specific and documented way possible. Victoria knows exactly what this cost. The board knows. The clients know or will. There is no longer any version of this where the old story, where she built the division with her vision, and I was just a valuable employee, holds up. That story is gone. Patricia thought about that. She said that she acknowledged it. In the coffee place this morning, without me having to push for it, which matters. Why does it matter that you didn't have to push? Because an acknowledgement that has to be forced out of someone isn't really an acknowledgement. It's a performance of accountability without the actual thing underneath it. She said it because she had arrived at it herself. That's different. Patricia was quiet for a long moment. "All right," she said. "Then I'll be there Monday morning with the 17-page folder and a very long list of things we need to fix." "Bring coffee," Daniel said. "Enough for the whole team." "I'll bring the good stuff. None of the lobby machine whatever." "That's always been my preference." "I know," she said. "That's why I always made sure you had it." He called Margaret Chen on Thursday morning. She picked up on the fourth ring, and when she heard his voice there was a pause before she said anything. Not surprise exactly, but the particular stillness of a person recalibrating. "Daniel, I wasn't expecting this call." "I know. I appreciate you picking up." "You're coming back to Meridian." "It wasn't entirely a question. I am. I'm calling before I formally return because you deserve to hear it from me directly and because I want to be honest with you about where things stand." "And where do things stand?" "Not well from your perspective. I know the quarterly review didn't go the way it needed to. I know you sent a legal inquiry about the renewal terms. I know what that means." A beat. "And what do you think it means?" "It means you're a professional who protects her company's interests, and you have been watching a partner relationship that took 7 years to build, get managed carelessly for 4 months, and you are doing exactly what I would do in your position." Silence. "The question I'm asking," Daniel continued, "is whether you're willing to give me 60 days, not to make promises, not to give you a presentation about how things are going to be better. Just 60 days of actual evidence that the relationship is being managed the way it should be." Margaret Chen was quiet for a moment. "You know what bothered me most," she said, "about the last 4 months. It wasn't the timeline slippage on the integration project, though. That was real. It wasn't the dropped communications. It was that when I asked questions, I got answers that were designed to manage my perception rather than actually answer what I'd asked. I've been in business for 30 years. I know the difference." "I know you do." "Daniel, when you were managing this account, I always felt like I was talking to a person who respected my intelligence and my time. The last 4 months, I felt like I was being handled. That will not happen again. If I am managing this account, you will always get the honest version of whatever situation we're in, even when the honest version is uncomfortable, especially then." Another pause. 60 days, she said. 60 days. "And if at 60 days I don't see what I need to see, then you make the right decision for your company. I will not argue with it. I will not try to manage it. I will shake your hand and thank you for 7 years and wish you well." A long silence. "All right," she said. 60 days. "Thank you, Margaret." "Don't thank me. Earn it." "That's exactly what I intend to do." He set his phone down after the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of his home office. Emma's school picture on the desk. The whiteboard with the consulting notes that would be erased when he turned this room back into just a spare room. The ordinary afternoon light. I thought about what he was carrying into that building when he went back. Not just his experience, not just his record. Something that hadn't been there before, a knowledge of his own value, that wasn't theoretical anymore, wasn't based on what he hoped people would eventually see. It was based on evidence. On what had happened when it was removed. On the documented, reviewed, board-acknowledged record of what the division had been built on and what it had become when that foundation was taken away. I was not the same person who had quietly made Emma's lunch for 9 years while someone else took bows on a stage. He was the person who had made a decision at cost and been proven right, and was now walking back through the door with both the experience and the clarity that comes from having learned the hardest way that you are worth what you know you are worth. He picked up his phone one more time. He called Frank. "It's done," he said. "I heard," Frank said. News travels fast when a CEO walks into a coffee shop looking like she's going to confess something. You have eyes everywhere. I have eyes in specific places. How do you feel? Daniel thought about it. "Ready," he said. "No nerves. Some, but the right kind. The right kind is the kind that means you care about what you're walking into. Yeah? Then you're good, Frank said. Go rebuild the thing you built. That's the plan. And Daniel. Yeah. This time, let someone take notes on what you do. So the next time someone thinks about replacing you, they have to look at the documentation of every single thing they'd be losing. Daniel smiled. Already thinking about it, he said. He hung up. He went to the kitchen. He made dinner. Friday was tomorrow, and he had promised warm chip tacos, and some things the most important things needed to stay exactly where they were. He walked back into Meridian Technologies on a Monday morning. Not the same Monday morning energy of 9 years of arrivals. Not the invisible man, the quiet engine, the person who showed up before everyone else and left after everyone else and asked for nothing except to be allowed to do the work right. This was something different. Something he couldn't quite name until he was in the elevator going up to the 22nd floor, and he realized what it was. He wasn't braced. For 9 years, he had stepped into that elevator every morning, carrying some version of tension, the low-grade constant readiness of a person who knows the environment they're walking into requires them to be prepared for anything. To be smaller than they are in certain rooms and larger than they feel in others, to manage up and protect downward and absorb whatever came from the middle. He had done it so long that the tension had stopped feeling like tension and started feeling like the normal physical state of being a professional in that building. It was gone now. He wasn't braced. He was just ready. Lou was at the parking garage. Mr. Carter. The old man's face broke into something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite relief, but was somewhere between the two. Heard you were coming back. Morning, Lou. Things got a little rough while you were gone. I heard. Glad you're back. Daniel looked at him. How's the knee? Still complains when it rains. Probably always will. Probably, Lou agreed. But I've made my peace with it. Daniel nodded and walked to the elevator and pressed 22. The team was already assembled in the large conference room when he arrived. Patricia had organized. He hadn't asked her to, but he wasn't surprised that she had, because Patricia organized things the way some people breathed automatically and without needing to be reminded that it was necessary. They were all there. Beverly, who stood up when he came through the door in a way that was not a formal gesture, but simply what her body did when he walked in. Chris Alvarez, who looked like a man who had been through something and come out understanding more than he did before, which in Daniel's experience was the only useful outcome of being put through something hard. 6 other team members, some he had worked with for years, some newer, all of them with the particular expression of people who had been waiting for this specific morning. He looked around the room. He didn't make a speech. He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table the same way he had always sat down at that table, and he said, "Tell me what's broken, and tell me what we'd need to fix it." The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then Beverly laughed, a real one, the kind that comes from recognition, from hearing something that sounds like the beginning of something instead of the end. And then Chris laughed too, and then the room started talking, and Daniel Carter listened to every word. The first 30 days were hard in the specific way that rebuilding is always hard. Not dramatic, not crisis to crisis. The dramatic part had already happened, and what was left was the slower, more demanding work of restoring something that had been damaged, not destroyed, not beyond recovery, but damaged in the ways that trust gets damaged when people have been let down by a structure they had believed in. He reinstated the weekly debrief in the first week. The first one was slightly stilted. People were careful feeling their way back toward the kind of honest conversation that the room used to hold naturally. He didn't push. He just asked questions and listened and gave the space time to remember what it had been. By the third debrief, Beverly raised a concern about a mid-tier client account that had been drifting and that nobody had flagged in the individual reporting model because it didn't yet show up clearly in the numbers. Just a feeling. Just the early warning sensor of someone who had been doing this long enough to notice when something was slightly off before it became visibly wrong. Daniel listened. He asked 3 questions. He assigned a follow-up. The concern turned out to be accurate. The account had been in early-stage drift. They caught it 6 weeks before it would have become a formal problem. After that debrief, Chris came to Daniel's office. "That's what it's supposed to look like," he said. "Yeah. I tried to catch things like that in the old structure. There was no mechanism. I'd write it in a report, and it would go to where reports go, I guess. And by the time anyone did anything with it, it was already a problem. Every time." Daniel looked at him. "You did good work through a bad system, Chris. That matters. The fact that the system failed doesn't mean you did." Chris was quiet for a moment. "The Callaway Systems situation," he said. "I've been carrying that." "Don't. I should have pushed harder." "You pushed as hard as the structure allowed. I've read every document from that period. You escalated twice before the weekly review. You were told to follow the process. You followed the process." Daniel met his eyes steadily. "What happened to the Callaway project is not a Chris Alvarez failure. It's a structural failure, and the structure has changed." Chris nodded slowly. "We're going to fix Callaway," Daniel said. "You and I together starting this week. You know the technical side better than I do at this point. I know Robert Alcott and how to manage that relationship. We do this as a team." "Okay. And Chris, the next time you have a concern that isn't being heard, you come directly to me. Not to a report, not to a process, to me." "What if you're the one not hearing it?" Daniel looked at him. "Then you tell me that too," he said. "That's the only way this works." The Callaway Systems recovery took 6 weeks. Daniel called Robert Alcott on the first day back and had the kind of conversation that he had always believed in. Direct, honest, no managed language, no presentation. He told Alcott exactly where the project stood, exactly what had gone wrong, and exactly what he was going to do about it. Alcott listened. When Daniel finished, Alcott said, "How long have you been back?" "This is my second day." A pause. "That's a hell of a second day. I'd rather have this conversation now than let another week pass with you wondering whether anyone over here actually knows what's happening." Daniel. A pause. "I'm not going to pretend the last 4 months were fine. They weren't. I was building a file of alternatives." "I know. I want you to know that. I'd expect nothing less from someone who runs a serious operation. But I also want you to know that I always believed the underlying relationship was worth preserving. I just wasn't sure the relationship still existed." "It does. Different circumstances, same commitment." Another pause. "Send me the recovery timeline by end of week, real numbers. You'll have it Thursday. And Daniel, it's good to hear your voice. Yours too, Robert." Margaret Chen's 60 days ended on a Thursday in April. Daniel drove into the Hartfield Group's offices for the quarterly review himself, not a video call, not a delegated team presentation. He sat across the table from Margaret Chen the way he had always sat across from her with the documentation and the numbers and the honest account of where things stood, including the parts that weren't perfect yet, because they were still in the process of being repaired. Margaret Chen listened to everything. She asked her questions. She got her answers. At the end of the meeting, she looked at Daniel with the direct, unornamented expression that he had always respected in her. "The renewal terms," she said. "I'd like to proceed with the standard structure, extended to a 3-year term." 3 years was longer than any previous contract they had signed. Daniel kept his expression professional. "We'll have the draft to you within the week." "I know you will." She paused. "Daniel, I've worked with a lot of people in this industry over a long career. What you did leaving when the situation became untenable, and then being willing to come back and repair the damage without making it a performance, that's not common. I came back because the people in that building deserved better, and because the work mattered. I know why you came back. That's what I mean." She stood. She offered her hand. 3-year term. Don't give me a reason to revisit it." "We won't." He drove back to the office. He didn't announce the news with an email or a company message. He walked into the conference room where Beverly and Patricia and Chris were running the afternoon project check, and he set the signed letter of intent on the table, and he said, 3-year renewal, extended term. Beverly put both hands over her mouth. Patricia looked at the letter and looked at Daniel and said very quietly, "There it is." Chris picked up the document and read it and set it down and said, "How?" 60 days of doing the work right, Daniel said. That's how. The internal statement went out on a Friday. Victoria had held to her word. Daniel had been involved in drafting it, and the version that went to the full company was the honest one. It did not use the language of corporate diplomacy to sand the edges off what had happened. It said clearly, and in specific terms, that the restructuring decision of the previous year had been made in error, that it had created harm to the division and to the client relationships the division depended on, and that the division's success over the preceding 9 years had been built on the leadership of Daniel Carter and the team he had developed. It named Beverly. It named Patricia. It named Marcus, who was no longer with the company, but whose contribution deserved to be on the record. It was 3 paragraphs long, and it said more in those 3 paragraphs than most corporate statements managed to say in 3 pages. Daniel read it when it went out sitting at his desk, and felt something settle in him that had been slightly unsettled since the day he walked back through the door. Not vindication, that wasn't the right word, and he had learned over the years to be suspicious of the satisfaction that came with being proved right, because that satisfaction had a way of becoming its own kind of trap. It was something quieter. The simple acknowledgement of a truth that had always been true, finally being said out loud in the place where it had always needed to be said. Beverly stopped by his office that afternoon. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair, the same position, 9 years of that chair, and she didn't say anything for a moment. "Marcus called me," she finally said. "He read the statement." "What did he say?" "He said to tell you thank you, and that you were the best manager he ever had." Daniel was quiet. "He okay?" he asked. "He's good. He's somewhere he's happy. He said the temperature is right." "Good." A pause. "That matters." Beverly looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "When you left, did you know it was going to end up here, that it was going to come back around?" He thought about that honestly. "No," he said. "I hoped things would work out somehow, but I didn't know what working out would look like. I didn't know if I'd come back here or build something new somewhere else or what. I just knew that I couldn't keep being somewhere that didn't respect the work." "Weren't you scared?" "Terrified," he said without hesitation. "I had a 9-year-old and a mortgage, and I walked away from the only professional home I'd known for almost a decade. Of course I was scared." "But you did it anyway." "I did it anyway." He looked at her. "Because the thing I was more scared of was staying. Staying and watching everything I'd built get handed to someone who didn't understand it, and telling myself it was fine, because at least I still had a paycheck and a badge." Beverly nodded slowly. "Some people would have stayed," she said. "A lot of people would have." "I know." "What made the difference?" He thought about Emma at the kitchen table eating cereal at 3:30 in the afternoon, and telling him he was going to make a better poster. He thought about his father's voice saying the world will take what you let it take. He thought about Lou and his knee that always complained when it rained, and the particular peace of a man who had made his peace with what was. "My daughter," he said, "and my father, and probably the fact that I'd been watching the thing I cared about most being slowly dismantled by people who didn't understand its value. And there was a point where watching that was more painful than whatever walking away was going to cost." Beverly was quiet. "You know what the funny thing is," she said. "Tell me, if they'd just treated you right, none of this would have happened. The company would have kept growing. Gerald Marsh would have renewed without a single worried phone call. Callaway Systems would be on track. We wouldn't have lost Marcus or anyone else." "I know. It cost them so much more to lose you than it ever would have cost them to keep you properly." "That's usually how it works," Daniel said. "People find out the value of the thing when it's gone." "Does that make you angry?" He thought about it. "It used to," he said. "Now it mostly just makes me want to do the job right. Because the best answer to all of it, to being undervalued, to being replaced by the wrong person, to watching things fall apart, the best answer is just to come back and build it better and make sure the record is accurate this time. That's it. That's the whole answer." Beverly smiled. A real one, the kind that went all the way up. "Then let's build it," she said. That evening, Daniel picked Emma up from her after-school program at 5:15. She climbed into the back seat with her backpack and her lunchbox, and the particular energy of a 10-year-old who had been moving at full speed since 7 in the morning and still had opinions to express about all of it. "Dad, okay. Something happened today and I need to tell you about it." "Tell me." She launched into it, a situation involving Mia and Lily, and something that had happened at lunch that was complicated by a misunderstanding from last week that had not actually been resolved the way everyone thought it had been, and the whole thing had a structural complexity that rivaled most of the client relationship issues Daniel had managed that day, and he listened to every word of it. By the time they pulled into the garage, she had talked herself to a conclusion. "I think I just need to be direct with both of them and say exactly what I think happened and what I need to happen next," she said, instead of waiting for one of them to figure it out. "That's the move," Daniel said. "I know." She gathered her things. "It just feels scary to say the direct thing sometimes." "It always does." "Does it get easier?" He turned to look at her in the back seat, his daughter with his eyes and her own particular way of seeing everything 10 years old, and already asking the questions that took most people decades to get to. "Yeah," he said. "It gets easier. Not because it stops feeling scary. Because you learn that the scary thing is usually smaller than the thing you're afraid of if you don't say it." She thought about this with great seriousness. "That's kind of wise, Dad. I have my moments. More lately," she said, climbing out. "You've been having more moments lately." He laughed. He locked the car and followed her inside, and the house smelled like the slightly defiant cereal at 3:30 snack she had clearly had again, and Emma dropped her backpack in the exact spot she had been dropping it for years, despite 9 years of gentle redirection, and Daniel stepped over it the same way he always stepped over it. He stood in his kitchen, and he thought about everything it had taken to get to this ordinary evening. 9 years of invisible work, one decision made at cost, 4 months of rebuilding himself while something else came apart without him. A coffee shop conversation that required both of them to tell the truth. 60 days of proving to Margaret Chen that the relationship still meant something. 3 paragraphs in a company statement that finally said out loud what had always been true, and Emma's backpack on the floor where it always was, and Friday tacos, and Lou's knee that complained in the rain. He started making dinner. He had learned in the long way that some things can only be learned, that a person's value is not a thing that requires an audience to exist. It does not need to be announced or applauded or credited in a presentation. It exists in the work, in the relationships, in the slow and unglamorous accumulation of doing things right when no one is watching, and doing them right again the next day and the day after that. The company had not made Daniel Carter valuable by employing him. He had been valuable the whole time. The only thing that had changed, the only thing that had needed to change, was that now everyone who needed to know it knew it. And the single father who had once walked out of a boardroom with nothing but his coffee mug and his integrity had come back, not because he needed to, but because he was exactly the kind of man who, when given the choice, chose to build, rather than walk away from the wreckage of something that still had good people inside it. That was who Daniel Carter had always been. It just took losing him for the world to find